So we'll have the presentations first and the discussion can follow afterwards. And I would like to first invite Dr. Nandini Bhattacharya Panda, who will be speaking on the mutated tradition, indigenous knowledge and imperatives of governance in early colonial Bengal. Dr. Panda.
Thank you, Professor Farooqi. And I'm very thankful to Amit for inviting me over here. The title of my paper is The Mutated Tradition, Indigenous Knowledge and the Imperatives of Governance in Early Colonial Bengal. It evokes three distinct premises. The word tradition refers to the millennium-old classical tradition of the Dharma Shastras. The location of knowledge as referred to in this paper. The word indigenous is used here to imply the difference between pre-colonial and colonial knowledge. And I will elaborate on the premise of mutated in the course of the presentation. As for the main contention of the paper, it will briefly narrate the metamorphosis of select branches of the classical tradition of the Dharma Shastras to a functional instrument of colonial governance, namely Hindu law. Hindu law, an established constitutional and socio-legal category in post-colonial India, is a legacy of the colonial past. In other words, I examine inter alia how colonial invention, codification of Hindu law on the basis of selective branches of the Shastric tradition, Smriti, Nyaya and Mimamsa, transformed the extant forms of pre-colonial knowledge and displaced Indian agency. Quote, the capacity of Indians to make their own world, unquote, in the words of Ronald Inden. Pre-colonial tradition of the Dharma Shastras. It is not possible to embark on an elaborate analysis of the pre-colonial tradition of the Dharma Shastras and the recent debates on its historicity. I should be brief. The Shastras or Dharma Shastras comprised a vast corpus of literature produced over millennia, the language of which is Sanskrit. The content of the Dharma Shastras cannot be described by any single category and encompassed literature, aesthetics, statecraft, religion, philosophy, juridical and intellectual discourses beyond disciplinary boundaries. The corpus of literature availed dharma, the root of which means to hold, support and sustain. The precepts in this literary genre provided prescriptive, normative, moralistic guidelines or codes of conduct for the twice-born, marginally for the Shudras. The prescriptive norms were designed to regulate the entire life cycle of a Hindu individual, both men and women, from birth to death. The themes were wide-ranging from cosmogony, duties of a ruler, social, economic, familial, moral, religious, conjugal, and community-oriented behavior of a person of both sexes, actually including the third sex. The origin of this tradition is shrouded in uncertainty and myth. It is commonly held that the tradition directly derives from the Vedas, the Shruti, the oral knowledge, revelation of the divine precepts. The word Veda does not strictly refer to the Vedic texts. It refers to the totality of knowledge, the sum of understanding of all religions and moral truth, whether revealed or not. The Smriti, whose the literal translation is memory, the Smriti genre of literature is founded on the indirect perceptions founded on Shruti, memory on the basis of which dharma grew into a discipline. Robert Lingat used the word science instead of discipline, Dharma Shastras. Manusmriti is believed to be the first among the Smriti writers followed by several compilers over centuries. P.V. Kane believed that the time frame of Smriti compilation roughly ranged between 500 to 400 BC. Dharma Shastra tradition survived over millennia, uninterrupted through an evolutionary trajectory. There had been two broad divisions, Mitakshara, that emerged in Mithila in the 7th or 8th century. Subsequently, Mitakshara had three regional ramifications, Benares, Maharashtra, and Madras. Dayabhaga tradition emerged in Bengal around 11th century. The long life of the tradition suggests that the corpus of knowledge internalized contestation, divergence, and assimilation through the principal methodological tool, debate or discussion, torko. In the post-Smriti era, the vitality of the tradition was further invigorated by the interpretative discourses such as Tika, commentaries on the original Smriti text, the interpretations though varied from one author to another, and Nibandho, treatises or critiques of the original Smritis in which the author offered his own views. The extant text demonstrate that the interpretations had been necessitated by social changes and the felt need to accommodate the changes through discursive textualization. It is evident that the knowledge evolved as one integral to intellectual discourse and pedagogy, rather than one integral to administration. The Pandits came from different localities, not necessarily in close proximity of the administrative centers. Navadvip and Bhatpara were famous centers with some lesser known places as recorded in Adams' third report of 19th century. The community of scholars ran schools, Tol and Chotushpatis, as a part of Guru's household, and in Bengal, such institutions became virtually synonymous to the flourishing traditions of Smriti, Nyay, and Mimamsa. I would cite two lines from a verse composed by Rup and Sanatan, eminent disciples of Sri Chaitanya, that foregrounds the essence of this tradition, that is knowledge. I quote, Nyay Sriti Tattvogane Navadvip Shrestho Sarvadesh Hote Ashe Bubhutsu Goreshto. My translation. Navadvip is the premier center of knowledge, that is Gyan, on Nyaya, Sriti, and other branches or theories of knowledge. Eminent or senior scholars come from all over the country to visit here and to fill their hunger for knowledge. At the same time, the community of scholars received appreciation, respect, and generous material support from the kings and the local zamindars in the form of grants and rewards. It is evident from varied sources, mainly of 17th and 18th century, that the knowledge or the exponents of that knowledge, the Pandits, had multidimensional role in the society and the community. Well, I am not here speaking as an apologist for the Brahminical dominance. I am just summing up the overall societal structure gathered from various sources, a category of sources. The discourse on Raja Dharma point to the advisory role of the Pandits in the king courts or the local zamindars later on. Those reflected upon statecraft and moral directives for the king or the ruler. The Pandits' role as arbitrators in various kinds of disputes, such as property, inheritance, conjugal and family matters, condemning someone to be outcast, declaring auspicious days for travel, marriage, etc., is clearly evident in 17th, 18th century literature, for example. For example, Panchanan Mondol's collection of private letters from rural areas covering the period from 1684 to 1883 is a multi-voluminous document. Finally, was there any legal element in that tradition? The legal element, if any, in this tradition is reflected in the treatises on Vyabhahara, which constitutes a fraction of the entire tradition. J.D.M. Derrett translated the term Vyabhahara as litigation, while N.B. Halhed, the translator of the first code on Hindu law, he translated the term as justice. The most noticeable feature of the Vyabhahara treatises is the absence of any Sanskrit term synonymous to English term law. In fact, the entire literary corpus does not contain a single word synonymous to law. The Vyabhahara treatises reflect upon moral and just behavior, nature of dispute, modes of dispute resolution, and in case of deviation, the available or the advisable measures. I would briefly cite one normative principle prescribed in the Vyabhahara treatises for dispute resolution. The contending parties first report to the king as the supreme arbitrator. If necessary, the king sought help of an expert called Pradviveka, who were proficient in both Shastric norms and customary practices. He would offer his own opinion after questioning the contending parties. Usually, the Pradvivekas were Brahmins, but a person from higher caste, not Brahmin, but higher caste, who commanded knowledge over both Shastras and custom, and who had logical reasoning, they also performed the role. Finally, all the treatises in the entire literary genre, including that of Vyabhahara, had been written in Vidhiling, that is, should, not definitive or coercive, the standard expression in legal texts. The nature of punishments are also interesting, such as, in case of culpable behavior, someone is cursed to go to hell, or to born as a jackal, or to be infected by leprosy, and so on. Now, Dharma Shastras in colonial knowledge and the invention of Hindu law. It is intriguing why the British officials perceived and presented selective branches like Sriti, Nyaya and Mimamsa as authentic laws of the Hindus. Was it ignorance? Was it misunderstanding or deliberate misrepresentation? The Orientalist veneration for the sacerdotal text is an established fact. It is likely that they were confused about the vast customary practices of the land, and that was difficult to gather and collate. Shastric literature offered them an easy instrument. Hindu law, within quote, was a strategic measure to appease Hindu subjects by giving them the impression that the new rulers administered their own sacred law, who, they thought, would be the pillar of the imperial edifice. I have argued in my book, Appropriation and Invention of Tradition, that Hindu law was not a collaborative project, as argued by David Washbrook, Christopher Bailey, et al. It was an imperial project based on pragmatic need of the early agents of the East India Company. For example, Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General in Bengal, appointed a team of 11 Pandits in 1772 to compile a code in Sanskrit, Vivadarnava Setu, which means the bridge on the ocean of dispute. N.B. Halhed translated and published the text through a Persian rendering under the title A Code of Gentoo Laws in 1776. Please note the qualitative difference in the meaning of the titles. Vivada means debate or dispute, torko. And thus the Sanskrit title was tuned with the knowledge tradition, while the English title set a new dimension to the extant tradition, law. As far the content is concerned, the Gentoo law also fundamentally deviated from the original Sanskrit version, and I cannot really discuss all this here. William Jones, the erudite Orientalist and the juridical ideologue of the British Empire, was the architect of the second court. He appointed Jagannath Tarko Panchanan, the legendary scholar on all branches of the Dharma Shastras, to compile a detailed and comprehensive text. And the product was Vivado Bhangarnavo, the break wave in the ocean of disputes. The text is huge, incorporated several issues relevant for the administration. The text was, however, written in Nyaya-Mimamsa style. The author analyzed various scholars on a given issue, and then he recommended the opinion of a particular author through logical reasoning. It was not the language of law. Jones could not translate the text due to his untimely death. H.T. Colebrook translated and published the text as Digest of Hindu Laws in 1800. The digest gives a clear impression that the translator was well versed in extant European literature on law and spontaneously used the terminologies such as forensic term, within quote, a term suitable in the law court, or alienation, the Lockean theory of property, to clarify the issues to the European readers. Such methods made Hindu law codes into a modern legal treatise in late 18th century Bengal. Whether the colonial Hindu law codes could bring legal modernity in India is a different issue altogether. But here I would briefly add, William Jones translated Manusmriti for the first time in English in 1794 under the title Institutes of Hindu Law or Ordinations of Manu, according to the gloss of Kulluko, comprising the Indian system of duties, religious and civil. Manusmriti means hard perceptions or memories from Manu. The English title projected it as a legal text, more particularly religious and civil laws of the Hindus, although Jones himself evaluated Manusmriti as, I quote, absurd and ridiculous, unquote, in which punishments are, I quote, partial and fanciful, unquote. To conclude, the post-colonial codes on Hindu law was essentially based on colonial codes and Anglo-Hindu jurisprudence on the assumption or belief that those represented the traditional laws of the Hindus. My submission is that the whole idea of Hindu law was a British administrative invention. Hindu law, within quote, pushed the pre-colonial tradition, a corpus of knowledge that evolved and flourished over century and millennia, to liminality and depth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Panda. I'm sure we'll have good discussion on this project, which is foundational to colonial processes. So we'll now move to the next paper. Professor Balaji Ranganathan, who will be speaking on the law and state in pre-colonial India and understanding. Professor Balaji.
Thank the Chair. I'd like to thank the Nehru Memorial Library and the organizers for inviting me here again. Always a pleasure coming here. And thank you, Professor Panda, because it appears my paper is going to be a continuation of yours. All right. Hope I have a few departures. Yeah. Now, this paper seeks to understand the formation of the law and the manner by which it was received within pre-colonial India. This paper will be brief in terms of analysis owing to the large scope of the subject in hand, but it will try and bring out the salient features of the law that constructed it. The subject of these ancient texts have been much commented on in recent times as being texts that abrogated power, centralized power, and this led to a mass subjugation of people who did not qualify to be a part of this literary corpus. And this has seen the rise of Dalit nationalisms within India, which hold these texts to be formative in the subjugation of an entire class of people. I shall not be debating this in my paper, as the focus is on to have an understanding of this early society which created the corpus. The beginnings of the law in India, if I use a law in a modern day term, begins with the Vedic period with an emphasis on Dharma. I shall talk about it later in my paper, as Dharma will be equated to the law with the Dharma Shastras. Some of the prominent Dharma Shastras were the Manusmriti, the Yajnavalkya Smriti, Narada Smriti, Vishnu Smriti, Brihaspati Smriti, and the Katyayana Smriti. Now, dating is a massive problem here. In a sense, there's a time and a space problem with these early texts. So, of course, Kane and Peter Ogle both have given dates for these particular texts, but there's a lot of controversy on this. And the earlier sutras which predate these Dharma Shastras are the codes of Apastamba, Gautama, Bodhyana, and Vashishta. In a sense, you have the sutras that come in early, and then you have the smritis that come in. These texts have been used for legal opinion and judgments within the colonial period, even today, and it needs to be made clear that these normative texts were mostly meant for Brahmins in that period, who were also the authorial authorities. They discuss the rules of the ashrama, the 4 ashramas, studenthood, domestic household duties, renunciation, diet, the duties of various systems, sacrifices, funeral practices. And they actually contain 3 major topics of engagement, in the sense achara, vyavhara, and the prayaschitta. Now, achara provided rules of your daily rituals, life cycles, specific duties of the 4 ashramas, and proper conduct, while vyavhara dealt mainly with the law and the legal procedures, which included the duty of the king, the idea of Rajdharma, examining witnesses, and effecting punitive punishment for any criminal activity. In fact, the legal procedures included that of 5 cases was called the Vyavahara. The equivalent of the modern plaint was called Purva Paksha, and that of the written statement as Uttara. The trial was called Kriya, and the verdict as Nirnaya. In fact, the Brihaspati Smriti has a description of the legal systems. In the sense, there were 4 kinds of tribunals, namely the stationary, the movable courts, the royal signet in the absence of the king, and the commissions under the king's presidency, and a hierarchy of the courts, if I can use the modern day term. In the villages, the Smritis tell you that you had something called the councils, or the kulanis, which dealt with the simple civil and criminal cases, and at a higher level, in towns and districts, the courts, if I use that term again, because there's such a huge confusion on this, the courts were presided over by government officers under the authority of the king to administer justice. And in order to deal with problems among members of the artisanal class, traders, etc., trade guilds were authorized to exercise an effective jurisdiction over the members. Family courts were also established, and you had something called Puga assemblies made up of groups of families in the same village which decided civil disputes among family members. Minor criminal cases were dealt with judicial assemblies, whereas criminal cases of a serious nature were normally presented in the central court. There was an appeal system that was practiced, and the king was the highest body of appeal. Another notable feature was that you did not have a single person administering justice, in the sense you normally had a group of people administering it. There's a section on the Arthashastra, but I won't talk on that for the want of time. Coming to the nature of dharma, the word poses a dilemma, as it's not quantifiable within the Vedic corpus. Dharma is not action here, but an idea that constitutes a support. So any action that had to be virtuous was only that if it was supported by dharma. In fact, Peter Olwell, who has a critical edition on the Dharma Sutras, he would tell you that dharma may be translated as law if we do not limit ourselves to its narrow modern definition as a civil criminal statute. Yeah? But it has to take into account all rules of behavior, including moral and religious behavior, and that a community recognizes it as binding on its members. Now, for the want of scope in this and time, I shall briefly examine just the Apastamba Sutra and its concerns. Yeah? Now, the Apastamba Sutra, like most of the Smritis and the other sutras, are pretty extensive in terms of everyday life as well as achara, the normal behavior. But it does mention 4 classes of people. I mean, in the sense, the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, of course, they are mentioned. And interestingly, on kinship, that this text mentions that a Brahmin may have 4 wives, a Kshatriya 3, a Vaishya 2, and a Shudra 1. It also talks of mixed classes of people. Now, this is interesting because this is going to be that larger argument that's going to come ahead. It says, when I say mixed classes, I'm talking about interracial marriages that are happening, kinship rituals that are happening in early India. It says sons born from the wives of the same class as the husbands or the class immediately below him are the Savarnas. Sons born from wives 2 or 3 classes below the husband are the Ambasthas, Ugras, and the Nisadas. And sons born from the wives in the reverse order of class are the Ayogyas, Magadhas, Vainas, Pulkashas, Kukutas. I mean, it's a long list. But what's interesting, is this particular line. It says, a 5th generation son, fathered by a Nisada, from a Nisada woman, rids himself of the Sudra status. Yeah? And one may perform his initiation. One may officiate at a sacrifice of a 6th generation son. In the sense, the kind of a monolithic idea that we are having of the Smritis, in the sense, hereditary, the notion of hereditary birth and so on and so forth, is absolutely not there within the sutras. Yeah? Even if you read the Manusmriti, you're going to find this. So this larger debate that these Smritis and these legal texts were monolithic in order, and you have the 4 ashramas, the 4 classes of people, there's something called hereditary birth, is something that I'm going to reject here. Yeah? Now, this is interesting because most of the community categories mentioned here are extinct today. Now, that's something very fundamental, isn't it? And I'm surprised people don't see that. Most of the communities that are mentioned within the Smritis are not there today. In the sense, these were categories meant for a particular time and a particular space. That's something that has to be understood and that has been removed out of its time and space. What could be the broad reason for the social arrangement and the specific emphasis on genealogy and birth? As I understand it, early India was a fluid, dynamic space of various communities that migrated into the Gangetic Valley. Some of it by conquest, like the White Huns, the Greeks, the Central Asian communities like the Kushans. They had brought in different cultural codes, and this made it necessary to make a differential status in terms of birth. It can be taken as a protectionist exercise, which led to the formation of these codes, which later become normative, especially during the colonial period. Speaking on the legal system now, the Apastamba Sutra has a very clear idea on the idea of jurisprudence. The legal sources are the Vedas, and it mentions the nature of a legal assembly. It says 4 men, each proficient in one of the 4 Vedas, 1 exegete, 1 man who knows the Vedic supplements, 1 legal scholar, and 3 learned Brahmins belonging to the 3 different orders of life, the 3 ashramas. Yeah? They constitute a legal assembly with a minimum of 10 members. Or there could be 5 or 3 or even a single man if he is of an unimpeachable conduct. May explain the law, but not the others, be they in their thousands. And the sutra goes on to mention the difficulty of administering this kind of a law. It says, the law has many gates, and its path is narrow, and it is difficult to follow. When there's a doubt, therefore, 1 man, however learned, should not pronounce on it. It's just this beautiful idea, of having a divisional bench and a normal bench in courts today. The anxiety of this early society is extremely evident where the text goes on to examine the nature of geography, because I'm trying to understand this idea of purity, inclusion, exclusion. Yeah? That's connected to this law. The anxiety of this early society is extremely evident here where the text goes on to examine the nature of geography and the inhabitants that live in it. This is important to understand that the idea of purity, which later becomes a law, is more to do with the influx of communities that migrated through and settled within the various parts of India. The codes here become a safeguard to construct and maintain cultural practices which are clearly in threat as early Indian society stabilizes with the acceptance of various communities. The text mentions on the distinction between the south and the north of India. And this is a rare thing because Dakshinapata is something that's not very well explored within early Indian texts. It says, and of course, Apastamba Sutra is a South Indian text, in a way. It originated there. There are 5 areas in which I'm just citing the Apastamba Sutra. It says there are 5 areas in which practices of the south and the north differ from each other. We'll explain the ones peculiar to the south. They are eating in the company of an uninitiated person, eating in the company of one's wife, eating stale food, and marrying the daughter of the mother's brother or the father's sister. The entire notion of endogamy. The ones peculiar to the north are selling wool, drinking, trafficking in animals with teeth in both jaws, making a living as a soldier, and traveling by sea. Now, this is where this entire idea of Kalapani might be coming in. If a man follows the practices of the former in the latter, or those of the latter in the former, he becomes defiled. Each practice is based solely on the authority of the customs of that region. So it's not monolithic, as I understand it. On the land of the Aryas, because the Aryas was so much of focus, wasn't it, within colonialist history. It says, it actually mentions the geography. It says the region to the east of where the Saraswati disappears, west of the Kalaka forest, south of the Himalayas, and the north of the Pariyatra mountains is the land of the Aryas. The practices of that land alone are authoritative. And it's a very localized idea, what I'm trying to bring in. And it later on becomes something which is pan-Indian, and it becomes a normative function. Speaking about the border regions, the text mentions the inhabitants of Avanti, Anga, Magadha, Saurashtra, the Deccan, Sindh are of mixed blood. If someone visits a land, he should offer prayaschitta. That's the larger prescription. I shall conclude my discussion of the Apastamba Sutra with a look at the idea of inheritance within this text, as it influenced the Hindu law of succession with Hallhead, what Dr. Panda was talking about within the William Jones's translation. The text mentions an inheritance. Inheritance in the absence of other heirs, the estate goes to the relatives belonging to the same ancestry. In their absence, to the relatives belonging to the same family line. In their absence, the teacher who had been like a father to the deceased, or a student or officiating priest of the deceased may take it, and in their absence, the king. But let him donate that property to persons deeply versed in the 3 Vedas. The king, however, should never appropriate the property of Brahmins. Now they also quote, poison kills just one man, but a Brahmin's property destroys even his sons and grandsons. Poison is not truly poison, they say. The true poison is the property of a Brahmin. Therefore, a king should never appropriate the property of Brahmins, for it's said that the property of Brahmins is the deadliest poison. And remember, these are texts by Brahmins for Brahmins. All right? Okay. Yeah. One can understand through the translation projects of the Asiatic Society, from Jones to Colebrook and up to Prinsep. Prinsep, of course, never actually wrote on stuff. He worked more on numismatics and Brahmi. However, this law was at variance with the law of primogeniture within the English common law, and the problems of translation became the property, according to the sutra, could be handed over to a large number of people. Now, if I take inheritance according to this sutra, let's say my son might not inherit my property. It could be handed over to anybody else. But within English common law, it's primogeniture which would work. In the sense, it has to be a direct relative who can receive the property. And this is where you have the divergence coming. Now, I'll not take on the rest of this, because the rest has already been covered by Dr. Panda. How the colonial India received this law and transformed it. But I was interested in looking at how this law making a transition to Islamic law from the 8th century onwards. Yeah, and with Mir Qasim and the conquest of Sindh and so on and so forth, and the formation and the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate. Here, you have this transformation away from this law. In the sense, probably for the first time, you're encountering a civil law within India. Right? Now, for this, I was looking at a source called the Mirate-e-Ahmadi, because that's a viable source for us, especially with Gujarat. That's a source we would use. And the source talks about how there's something called a Kotwali Chabutra. Yeah? And the Kotwali Chabutra is a place where people would bring in their complaints of theft, assault, and homicide. Yeah? And especially with the coming of the Delhi Sultanate, you have these two major figures that come in, two constitutional figures within the legal within legal terms. One would be the Kotwal and the Qazi. Yeah? In the sense, the Kotwal has a primary judicial function where he has to decide the problems. I'll talk about them. While the Qazi would be directly linked with ideas like assault, injury, quarrels over marriage, inheritance, and property. Yeah, so you have a very well-defined division of legal duties between the two within Islamic law. This continues in the sense from the Delhi Sultanate onwards, right up to the Shah Jahan period. Correct me, Professor Farooqi, if I'm wrong. Yeah, right up to the Shah Jahan period, you might have this basic idea functioning, but it's in around 1670 that the entire thing changes with this transition to the Hanafi code of jurisprudence that comes in with the Fatwa-e-Alamgiriya, which Aurangzeb had compiled. So in 1670, Aurangzeb had ordered a compilation of these extracts from the Hanafi school of jurisprudence, in which he had a syndicate of scholars who had to go through these Islamic law books in the Imperial Library. And this author called Masir-e-Alamgir, who reportedly wrote this text in 1710, attributed Aurangzeb's decision to have his desire to make a general Muslim public act, so that legal decisions and precedents of the ulama of the Hanafi school could be taken in. And this compilation was translated from Arabic into Persian to make it more accessible. Yeah? So in a sense, what I'm trying to tell you is this law is transcending. In a sense, we normally talk about Hindu law and then directly it's colonial law, but no, I won't even say it's the Smritis. There's a time and space for it. Because by the time, let's say, the Chaturvarna moves into the Jati systems, you already have Buddhist kingdoms, you have Jaina kingdoms, with a differing set of ethics, a differing set of laws coming in. It's not something that has extended for a couple of millennia ahead, uncontested. That's a larger idea. So this transition that's happening is from these early Shastras towards Islamic law, and from Islamic law coming down to colonial law. That's how jurisprudence operates here. Now, this compilation, Fatwa-e-Alamgiriya, which was translated from Arabic into Persian to make it more accessible, and it became a very authoritative source for guidance on interpreting Islamic law. And it's this particular law that is encountered by the various companies within India, trading companies, whether it's the Dutch, the French, or the British East India Company. That's what they encounter. Aurangzeb also institutes a category called the Mutasib, who had to enforce the Islamic code of morals, which included a ban on the purchase and sale of intoxicating drinks and drugs and so on. He had to prepare a daily schedule of the rates in the market, standardize weights, measures. In the sense, if you look at the judicial categories, you would find the Mutasib's role slightly overlapping that of the Qazi and the Kotwal. That's where there's a slight distinction that's happening. As far as this particular text is concerned, the Fatwa-e-Alamgiriya, what Aurangzeb instructed was a compilation of extracts from the Hanafi school of jurisprudence, and in the process, what happened was it changed the entire nature of penalties that you would see until the time of Shah Jahan. Yeah? So the nature of the penalties change. For example, let's say homicide. Now, within the English common law, homicide would mean either imprisonment or death. Yeah? But within the Hanafi school of jurisprudence, it did not mean that. The penalty would not be death unless blood was shed. Yeah? In the sense, for example, I'll just read that. In such cases, homicide are those in which no weapon is used to kill the victim. In the sense, if I shed blood, then it qualifies as homicide, and then it has to lead to a certain form of capital punishment. But if I don't shed blood, then I can get out honorably by paying something called blood money. Yeah? In the sense, dear. Now, this leads to that major problem, doesn't it? With the English common law coming in the sense, how does one administer territory where you have kingdoms, you have the Mughal, you have a very weakened Mughal empire, but still the Hanafi school of jurisprudence is present. You are having a political unrest in the early days of the company. So how are you going to administer the law? That's when they are engaging with this Hanafi school of jurisprudence, and they feel that they need a change of law, which would be more effective in administration. And that's where they start translating the Hindu laws of succession as well as the Muslim law of succession. Now, this also created one more major problem, in the sense, the idea of taking oath. I think I'll conclude after this. Yeah? The idea of taking oath. Now, the idea of taking oath is uniquely a European custom within the European legal custom. All right? So if you look at a very interesting case that happened, which was the case of Munif Begum, the regent of the Bengal Nawab. I mean, there was this massive quarrel that they had in the Privy Council, in the Privy Courts at that time, where she absolutely commented on record within those things, where she said that malicious people are now taking pleasure in calling up people of rank before the court to submit them to this humiliating procedure. In the sense, the notion of the word of honor, the personal self, was so absolutely evident. In the sense, early, if I call it Hindu law, then the nature of the dharma would automatically make you speak the truth. Let's hope so. Yeah? But within Islamic law, you did not have to take oath. In the sense, they had a pretty well-established civil procedure. But within the English courts, you had to take oath on this. And there was this massive problem on this. Then you had the Bhaval Sannyasi case and so on and so forth. These are very, very famous legal cases, colonial cases, where this problem of oath is constantly getting foregrounded. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Balaji Ranganathan. And now with these two papers which deal with taking off colonial law, I'm sure we'll have a rich discussion. We can now move to the third paper. Saifuddin Ahmed will be speaking on cultivation of an innovative style, the knowledge of linguistics and philology in the 18th century with reference to Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu.
Thank you, Chair. At the outset, I'd like to thank Teen Murthy Library and dear Amit for inviting and providing an opportunity to speak here. My paper attempts to explore the many oeuvres of Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu and his linguistics and comparative philology, as well as the cultural aspects of the era in which he was practicing his craft. He was an 18th century figure and a stalwart. There are a few of the technical terms that will be coming into, so the slides will be of help at that time. Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu was born in 1689 and died in 1756. He was one of the most distinguished literary figures of the 18th century. He was a great scholar, linguist, lexicographer, grammarian, commentator, as well as he was well versed not only in Persian, Arabic, Urdu, but also Sanskrit language. In the field of poetry, he was a genius who imparted whole new techniques and considered the exposition of novel ideas in elegant language to be the beauty of poetry. He commanded almost uniform mastery over different genres of poetry, say whether it was ghazal, qasida, which is a panegyric kind of poetry, masnavi, etc. In lexicography and linguistics, his supremacy was simply unchallenged at the time. Khani Arzu's critical acumen, a rarity among the Persian scholars, can be seen in his criticism of the Persian classics and his treatise that he wrote, Tambihul Ghafilin, which is, if you translate, that comes to the criticism of Hazin's poetry, and Dad-e Sukhan. Arzu's Nawadirul Alfaz, another Urdu dictionary that he wrote. Apart from that, Sirajul Lughat and Chirag-e Hidayat opened a new world of critical study of lexicography. Arzu not only excelled in respect of his contribution to Persian, but also he was one of the person who championed the cause of Urdu language that flourished in the 18th century. And became the language of the common masses that we'll be talking about a little later. 18th century poet, the famous poet Mir Taqi Mir, considered him to be the most learned and eloquent personality of his time. Muhammad Hussain Azad, who wrote his Ab-e Hayat, the Water of Life, which is the anthology of a number of important poets, and I quote from him, खाने आरजू को ज़बान उर्दू पर वही दावा पहुंचता है जो अरस्तु को फ़लसफ़े मंतीक पर है। जब तक कि कोई मंतीक अरस्तु के अयाल कहे जाएंगे, तब तक अहले उर्दू खाने आरजू के अयाल कहे जाएंगे. So खाने आरजू can make the same claim on Urdu, which Aristotle can make on philosophy and logic. As long as all logicians will be called the descendants of Aristotle, all Urdu speakers will be called the descendants of Khane Arzu. And this paper is divided into, I initially talk about his early life, his migration, his stay at Delhi, and finally Lucknow, where he dies in 1756. His full name was Sheikh Sirajuddin Ali, with the conferred title of Ustad Khan, and poetic surname of Arzu, which means hope, desire, etc. However, he was famous by the name of Khane Arzu. A number of sources, we are fortunate that there are a number of sources which shed light on the life of Arzu, which can be analyzed to weave through his literary erudition. From this viewpoint, the foremost source is Arzu's own Tazkira, Majmul Nafais. Literal translation will be The Gathering of Souls, completed in 1750-51. Apart from this, his contemporaries and disciples also provided important information about him. The list includes Ghulam Adi Azad Bilgrami's Masirul Kalam and Khazane Amira. Another of his disciples, Bindravan Das Khushgo, who was one of his disciples and close friend, he deserves a special mention because he provides us more intricate details about his life history than anyone else. His own account in his Tazkira, Majmun Nafais, does not mention either the date or the place of his birth. We have to go back to Brindavan Das Khushgo, who was a close friend, mentioning about his date in Safina-e Khushgo, and provides Arzu's father's chronogram about his son's birth, Nuzul-e Ghaibi, which is descent from the divine. Computing the numerical equivalent of the words leads us to 1687-88. He also mentions that his father, Sheikh Hisamuddin, came along with the army of Aurangzeb to Gwalior. Azad Bilgrami, in his Khazane Amira, describes Arzu as Akbarabadi, which Akbarabad was the medieval name of Agra, the present-day Agra. So he was implying that he was born in Agra. But there are contestations about whether he was born in Agra or Gwalior. Arzu has an inviolable pedigree, a mix of Sufic and poetical bloodline from his parents' side. His father, Sheikh Husamuddin, served in the army of Aurangzeb and was one among the many mansabdars of the estate. And he had a poetic bent of mind and composed poetry under the nom de plume of Husami and Husam. Sheikh Husamuddin traced his lineage from Sheikh Kamaluddin, the son of sister of Sufi saint Sheikh Nasiruddin Mahmud, famous as Nasiruddin Chiragh Dehlavi. From his mother's side, he descended from the family of Sufi saint Muhammad Ghaus Shattari Gwaliari, who further traced his lineage to Khwaja Fariduddin Attar of Nishapur in Iran. And so his mother family was based in Gwalior, and hence Arzu had spent considerable time in his childhood at Gwalior. Yesterday, Professor Neeta Kumar was talking about the invisible curriculum and the home school, and it is here also that we find Arzu getting his first education from the family. Arzu has his initial training in poetry and education under him, his father, at Agra. He was initiated into the field of education quite early, so much so that by the age of 6 he had finished reading different books of Persian besides Gulistan and Bostan of Sadi, acquiring academic fluency in Arabic by the age of 14, and thus which was considered to be an exceptional among his age group. Khushko reports that Arzu at times memorized 100 to 200 Persian verses at a night. So that kind of things he was doing. With the passing of his father in 1703, Arzu was faced with difficult times, and so he had to fend for himself. And so he joins the army of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, and goes to Deccan under the commandership of Prince Muhammad Azam Shah. Arzu served in the army for about 9 months when the news of death of Aurangzeb comes in, 3rd March 1707, and the struggle for succession ensues. And he talks about all these things, and so he returns on the request of his mother because the situation was not congenial, and so he comes back to Gwalior and he stays there. In the meantime, battle for the throne, Mughal throne, was ensuing. And finally, Prince Muazzam becomes the emperor. Arzu stayed at Gwalior for some time and then moved to Agra. It is reported in Safina Khushgo that Arzu stayed here for almost 5 years during the rule of Jahandar Shah. It is here that Arzu got an opportunity to hone his skills in the art of poetry in the company of Shah Gulshan, the stalwarts of the poetry at that time. Shah Gulshan, Mirza Hatim, Azmatullah Kamil, Muhammad Muqim Azad, and others. According to Brindaban, Arzu was attached to the court at Delhi, though soon he was sent to Gwalior on some assignment and spent about 6 years here. And here it is, he writes that he got the opportunity of composing poetry. In the meantime, the whole the saga of Mughal decline and the fightings that were going on, Arzu's services were terminated, and he was unemployed for a longer time. These political events of the time had a close bearing on Arzu's career. It was not out of context to recall the developments at Delhi and Agra, starting with the imprisonment of Farrukhsiyar and ending with the naturalization of Sayyid brothers who were the kingmakers at the time. And so in quick succession, there were a number of kings coming in and going. There was no stability at all. And so these events had a close bearing on Khan-e-Arzu and made him resolute, enduring, modest, and acquiescent. The training, composition, and good quality of his teachers and contemporaries, such as Mirza Muhammad Afzal Sarkhosh, Mirza Abdul Qadir Bedil, Mirza Abdul Jalil Bilgarami, and Nasir Ali Sarhindi, etc., polished his poetic acumen and made his compositions somber, serene, and soft. By the age of 25, Arzu has become a popular figure. Once the matters were settled at Delhi court with the capture of Agra fort by Sayyid Hussain Ali Khan in 1718, Khan-e-Arzu was back in Agra and appointed as the royal chroniclers, the Swahne-Nigar at Gwalior. Arzu finally comes to Delhi in 1720, and it is here that he comes in contact with Anand Ram Mukhlis, who was not only one of his disciples, but a friend, a disciple with enormous connections, not only at the court, but also in the literary circles. And so it is here that Anand Ram Mukhlis introduces him to the intellectuals of Delhi. He also makes provisions of his engagement at the court at Delhi, and he got a rank of 80 Savars and Jagir along with Istiqat Khan, who subsequently made his stay in Delhi comfortable. He was introduced to the intellectuals here. Arzu received support from Emperor Muhammad Shah's Khan-e-Saman, Ishaq Khan Shustri, and subsequent to his death, his son patronized him. After his son's death, his son patronized. So it was continuing process that he received patronage. And finally, he moves to Lucknow in 1754. There, in the service of Nawab, his life was made comfortable, more comfortable, but he was not destined to enjoy, and he dies within 2 years. So in 1756, he dies. Now I will be discussing about Khan-e-Arzu's multi-talented, multifaceted personality. He wrote copiously on diverse themes such as poetry, grammar that I had referred also. He gives about the details about his own writings in his Atiyah-e-Kubra, the great gift that was completed in 1735, which provides a fuller account of his poetic productivity and takes into account a list of 16 of his works, though it is not to include Sirajul Lughat, a work on lexicography. Majmun Nafais, completed in 1752, enlists 13 of Arzu's work with the exclusion of 8 that was part of the just mentioned Atiyah-e-Kubra's list. He started to compose poetry at an early age of 15. And for the first time, he composes his poetry at Mathura. And so you will find the local influence of Braj also coming in, the Gwaliori also coming into his poetry. That's what he defended later also, because it is to be noted that despite all Indian progress in the field of Persian language and literature, especially in the lexicography, the Iranians were never ready to accept the excellence of the Indian Persian writers. And so Arzu had to defend himself and why he was using these words into Indian. And the Iranian contention was that it is the repository of Iranians, despite the very fact that the Indian Persian is the classical Persian that you find here. But the Iranians were never ready to accept that. And so, through his writings, Sirajuddin Ali Khan-e-Arzu was defending. Sirajuddin Ali Khan-e-Arzu his works could be categorized into different, categories. So he wrote commentaries, he wrote dictionaries, and general critical works. So I'll be discussing about the lexicography that he made available. His expertise in the field of lexicography is beyond any dispute, and he has an edge over the other scholars of the period for his novel research, precise elucidation, analysis, and illustration of words and expression. His Sirajul Lughat, that was completed in 1734-35, is a major work based on original research of exceptional significance. It has approximately 40,000 words in it and is an indispensable reference work for people interested in the study of ancient poetry of Iran, and as it contains the words and quotation of older poets that are not found in preceding dictionaries. The importance of Sirajul Lughat lies also in its commentary on Burhan-e-Qati and Farhang-e Rashidi and other dictionaries that was completed around the mid-17th century. And it was mainly concerned with the correcting earlier dictionaries. It reveals close affinity of Persian. He was the one who was, establishing the close connections and affinity of Persian with Sanskrit language. He was the first. Chirag-e-Hidayat, the lamp of guidance, is a smaller work containing approximately 5,000 words and is repeatedly referred to as the second volume of Sirajul Lughat. I will not go into the details because of the paucity of times. I will be coming to another of his work, Nawadirul Alfaz, which is a dictionary in Urdu. And it is a dictionary of Indic words. Arzu bases his claim on the concord or the affinity of Sanskrit with Persian on correct linguistic observation. He comments in Nawadir on the phonetics, morphology, and semantics of various cognate words. The words that are exceedingly close in meaning and sound are considered by him as testimony of the linguistic proximity between two languages. On the whole, we can say that his lexicon are representative of his conscious plan of codifying Persian literature, culture, and Sirajul Lughat reassesses the old component of new Persian poetic tradition with fresh research methodology, such as the use of tawaffuq lisani, that is linguistic harmony between the languages. He talks about different and who has the right of using words, and he says that those who are learned should use these words. He was basically invoking the Arabic scholar Al-Sayuti's concept of correspondence of language, an idea simultaneously existence of the similar words in two or more languages, that is Arabic or Persian or Hindi or in all the three languages. In some cases, there are examples of borrowing naturally undergoing phonetic changes, as in the case of dole. Dole is a Hindi word which goes to dalv and then finally to dole in Arabic and Persian, which means bucket. Dole in Hindi also means bucket, and dalv or dole in Arabic also means the same. So the variation in the form of similar words is that the difference of dotted and non-dotted letters. For example, he says that dasht is an Arabic word, while the dotted dasht is a Persian one. However, the meaning in both the cases are similar, which means desert. Then matra is a Pahlavi form of Persian word meaning rain, and matra is an Arabic word also meaning rain. Maya is Pahlavi, means water, and ma in Arabic also means the same. he goes on to, and I will not go into the details because of the paucity of time. So again, the linguistic concord that he establishes. And so Sanskrit was known, what he writes about Sanskrit is Kitab-e-Hind. That means Sanskrit. And so he there are a whole lot of words which has this similarity, or the roots are similar. So here, Abhar, which means cloud in Sanskrit, so that becomes Abr in Persian. Ap is a Sanskrit one, where Ab is water, is Persian. So Ashv in Sanskrit, we know it's a horse. So Asp is the Persian. Angusht is the one thumb, and so Angusht is the same. Barchi, that we know, Barakshi. Tal becomes Tal. So there are a number of words. Case. Here. Gaze is the same one. So he tries to, establish these linguistic concord with him, and it is only later that the scholars would be going to realize this importance, and William Jones, as people were referring to, he also establishes that there was something which was closer, Sanskrit and the Persian languages. I will simply wind up my talk with this, that not only Persian, but he was also talking about championing the cause of Urdu language, which proliferated in the 18th century in a big way. Because of the Persian was considered to be a language spoken by the Iranians, and they never reconciled to the fact that the Indians were making progress in the field. Abul Fazl, Fazi, Khani Arzu himself. And there are episodes of, contestations of Sheikh Ali Hazi, who had come to India, an Iranian Shnobis scholar. Nonetheless, he contributed significantly to the Persian languages. But he had so much condescending attitude about India, Indians, the practices, that he was not ready even to meet Indians. Living in India, not ready to meet Indians. And so there are many stories and how Arzu would be, arguing with him and taking notes of his, wrong usage of the Persian words. And so he writes a compilation of dictionaries just to show that he had been wrong in using the words of Persian. Nonetheless, he claimed to be the one. So his advice, and he was a mentor to a number of budding poets of Urdu, so Mir Taqi Mir, Sada, Dard, etc., all were trained under him, Mukhlis, and a number of Hindu disciples who were learning Persians under him. So he advises them that it is better that you should hone your skill in your own language rather than trying your luck in a language which is not yours. So Sada has a beautiful couplet also that I'll just wind up by reading the couplet, saying that Tu kahan tak unki zubaan mein bolega bandh apni zubaan mein maniye rangeen. So how long you will be competing with the Iranians in their languages is better that you should compose colorful poetry in your own language, that is Rekhta, that is Urdu. And that's how, Urdu emerges. Because of the paucity of time, I could not discuss the whole thing, but nonetheless hope we'll be discussing if question comes in about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Saif. We have time for discussion. So the three presentations, they are now open for comments, questions, observations. Sudipto?
Yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you for this wonderful three set of papers. I have two specific questions, one for Dr. Bhattacharya Panda and one for Dr. Ranganathan. With regards to Dr. Bhattacharya Panda, you're talking about the Shastric tradition, the Hindu laws, the Dharma Shastras. This is in reference to going back to the works with the likes of Latamani, who talks about how public debates are taking place in the 19th century based on and this specifically with reference to sati, and how it's rather than women's rights on the question of sati, it's basically a debate on the scriptures. Now, what I would like to draw your attention to is that also in other spheres of public life, and not necessarily related to gender issues or otherwise, or law or legality, how in the 19th century, especially in Bengal, ideas and different interpretations of the Dharma Shastras and the Shastric traditions have played out. So, two specific references I would like to draw your attention to, and maybe take your comments on them. One was, and both to do with matters of sanitation and public health and hygiene in the urban spaces. One with regards to the burning and disposal of the dead. The British themselves, and specific references are there about the British themselves actually coming up with their own interpretation of how a dead should be burned or the dead to be disposed. And again, the second more interesting instance that I found, and you spoke of Bhatpada. Bhatpada being a center of Sanskritic learning, in ancient Sanskrit learning, from the medieval period, and continued up to the 19th century. And this is specifically when Bhatpada becomes an industrial center and a new municipality in 1899, that references are being drawn to the Shastras, and even so to the 1858 Queen's Proclamation, where old residents of Bhatpada are actually talking about this whole question of sewage disposal into the Bhagirathi, or they call it Bhagirathi, and then the Hooghly. And for Dr. Ranganathan, you ended your paper briefly. You spoke about this question of inheritance and property. What interested me was, and correct me if I'm wrong, and you're talking about the whole English common law and the laws of primogeniture which work in Britain at that point of time. But could you actually elucidate on this whole idea of property rights and legal rights to property, and not specifically in terms of inheritance, but also in terms of transference of property? Because in the late 18th century, what is happening is that Britain itself is coming up with specific ideas regarding legalizing the transfer of property, or legalizing the ownership of property through what we know as registries, right? So, while the British are doing this in the late 18th century, how in the metropole, how in the colonies are they trying to reconcile with these new laws, codified laws, with regards to their interpretation of Indian or Indic laws? Thank you.
Here.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the presentations. Well, this is a question both to Professor Panda and Balaji Ranganathan. The whole, what do we understand by law? Because in like Dr. Panda's reading, I felt you were drawing upon a positivist definition of law as statute or legislation, to conclude that there was no law as such in ancient India, which was, and then that the English were misconstruing like the fluid nature of like normative conduct to kind of codify it as law by textualizing tradition and resorting to select scriptures. So if, can we not draw upon a singular definition of law as like how the Benthamites looked upon law as primarily as in the positivist sense of legislation, and then to think broadly what could have been law in pre-colonial times. And thank you so much, Professor Ranganathan. That was very enlightening to me, because I was researching on the question of Kala Pani, and where does this injunction against crossing seas come from? And my hunch was that this is a very spurious colonial discourse, because there was so much evidence of natives crossing seas, and so how did the British come upon this this injunction against law, which against crossing seas. So thank you so much for the source. I hope to be in conversation with you more as to how perhaps this was drawing very selectively on certain textual sources to kind of imbibe it within this penal administration of colonial India to justify transportation at the time when in Bentham's Britain transportation as a punishment was becoming obsolete. So perhaps this needs to be discussed more. So thank you so much. What I wanted to know also from you is about the question of sovereignty as you discuss law and state. How was that defined in pre-colonial times? And because you talk about, and I'm very curious because whether sovereignty is being defined in territorial terms, because you talk about geography and then about how the genealogy of status is determined by birth only with identifying migrant groups. And I was fascinated if you could also tell me more about the category mlecha, because as how Aloka Parasha studies have familiarized us with mlechas and then the geography of how the mlechas are seen as outsiders to that territory. So was there any inductive process of the mlechas being assimilated within the geography and bringing them in? Another question, I'm sorry, I'm so curious, but about the thing of treason in Islamic law, whether there was. But I think we can discuss it later, yeah.
Should I begin?
One more and then you.
Mine is pointed to Dr. Saifuddin. Thank you for your excellent paper. I would be intrigued to know, for example, in the 18th century Mughal court, we also find the recognition of Hindustani, which confirms the assertion of the regional elite. So how would you link this? And again, the emerging Urdu, that was initially, till the 18th century, it was borrowing, for example, Persian terms, Persian color, taste, fragrance, idioms, etc., to legitimize its position. Because Persian was, in the 18th century, it was still the official language. So under such circumstances, would you consider Arzu as a pioneer who was incorporating consciously and systematically and poetically the indigenous terms and idioms and in the sense, or whether it was a systematic effort on the part of several other imaginaire Muslim poets, if we can use the term. So this is one aspect. Another thing that intrigued me was the use of terms like Gwaliari, Dehlavi, they were being venerated. So would you consider it as a shift of Ashraf identity from extraterritoriality to Indianness?
Should I respond?
Yeah.
First, to your question, Lata Mani. Yes, it is contentious tradition. Actually, the British codified law in the latter half of the 18th century, right? So the Sati debate, it came later, when Ram Mohan Roy initiated the action to abolish Sati. So this is one thing. Actually, my earlier project, it is not my project right now. It is not just I contend that there is, Hindu law was an invention. I substantiated it in an entire book. I did not say that there was no law in India. It is impossible. But I said, I argued, and still I argued, that all the Shastric texts were not law. Those can be considered as juridical principles. If you read Manusmriti, you will find there are so many contradictions in one not rule in what, like, take for example, Manu mentioned a female heir, Putrika. In one verse, I think it was the original verse, it said that Putrika is like the Putro. Because it is born of the soul of a person. In second verse, it says, well, Putrika cannot, in Bengal there were the Bingsho Uddharo, 1/20th share of the eldest son. So in the second verse says, Putrika cannot enjoy that right. In the third verse says, okay, in the case of, when Putrika is married, when Putrika dies, her property, it will not be, it will be devolved in the male line, not in the female line, like the daughters. And finally, it said, which the British took, that Putrika, man appointed Putrika, because that man wanted to beget a son, Dohitro, which is called Putrika Putro. I mean, this is just one example. So, Manusmriti, it is full of contradictions. I am not judgmental about the text. So, a text which is full of contradiction cannot be law. And you are asking about definition of law. Well, we are using the word law. We had gone to the law court. We are still going to the law court. We are the product of a colonial society. So, they imposed their notion of law. They, like you were talking about primogeniture. Another example. Bengal had so many Zamindaris families. There were 7 Zamindaris, big Zamindari family, being Bardhaman, Dinajpur, Midnapur. I mean, I'm forgetting. So most of all the Zamindari family, they used to follow law of primogeniture. The British were very, very threatened about the Zamindars. They thought that, it was the initial phase of the British rule. So they thought that they would use army to liquidate the British, because British did not have so much manpower. So through the codification, they promoted the idea of equal division of property rights. Thereby, if you go through Alice and Daniel Thorner's book and so many books on fragmentation of property rights in Bengal, that is the fallout of the colonial codification of equal division. That was not in the past. This is one thing. And Bhatpada, right. I belong to Bhatpada, right? Bhattacharya. Yeah, I belong to Bhatpada. Anyway, so Bhatpada was the center of Pandits. And you know that Bhatpada was situated on the bank of the Ganges. So initially, all those centers of excellence of the Pandits, it developed on the banks of Ganges, not only in Bengal, all throughout India. Because of the, I mentioned about the Torko tradition. So many people used to come and go, exchange of intellect. That was in the pre-colonial period. In the colonial period, what happened? River was the mode of transportation of industrial goods. So the jute mills, that developed. So, and rest is history.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You asked me about the transfer of property. Now, the texts in this period, especially up to the 7th and the 8th centuries, don't mention transfer of property in that sense. For the primary reason, I think the only sources where you can look at the handover of land or property would be through the inscriptions that you have around, whether it's inscription Karnataka or Indica or the copper plate grants. That's the only place. Mughal India, technically nobody owned land except the emperor, in a way, because the Mughal emperor could take over the land in case he wanted to take it over. So there was no guarantee that the property could be transferred, though you had that. But no, early India, no. You do not have this idea of the transfer of property. That's a very colonial thing that actually happens with the coming of the stamp duties and so on and so forth. Yeah? So your question, you could look up Amar Kosha and the Satapatha Brahmana. All right? These are the two texts that might give you something on sovereignty in early India. Because they are also looking at this idea of the Rashtra, not the Rashtra of today. Yeah? It's a very early version of Rashtra. It's an evolving idea that happens right from the Rig Veda downwards. But there you might get your ideas and notions of sovereignty within early India.
Now, what about the lectures?
Yeah. That's just a category. As I told you, like what I was talking about, border areas. Yeah. I'm not looking at it in notions of moral purity here. I'm looking at it more in terms of preserving your own ethnicity and racial characteristics. That's something that the Parsis preserve, and they all this comes from the same stock. Remember, whether it's the Zend Avesta or the Rig Veda and so on. Yeah. So that's where you have this idea of the Milacha. Milacha would mean anything that comes across the Hydaspes. Or,
and those who live beyond Aryavarta.
Beyond Aryavrata and beyond the Hydaspes. Nothing beyond that. Yeah?
There's another group called Yavanas also.
Lechas
and Yavanas.
Yavanas were very specific. No, that's a confusing term. Because
it's not at all confusing.
It would mean Greek. Confusing term in the sense it could also refer to the Greeks in one. And in the south, Yavanas would refer to the Adil Shahi, Bijapuri kingdoms and also. Yeah? So there's a dual use of that word.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Day, for a question. Regarding your first question about the Hindustani and incorporations. So, well, of course, in the 18th century, Urdu flourished in a big way. It was not to say that Urdu was not there in different forms. Right from Amir Khusro, you can trace its lineages. And over the years, that was there. But nonetheless, Amir Khusro never talks about, and he says that if you have to, gauge my, writings, these are the Persian ones that you should refer to. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean that he did not compose it. And it went from the north to south, Deccan, especially Deccan area, where it flourished for a longer time. And it is here from that it comes back to Delhi when Dakkani Urdu and Wali. Wali Dakkani was one. And there is controversy about whether he was a Dakkani or Ahmedabadi or a Gujarati. We do not have, So, nonetheless, so Urdu emerges in a big way. And for emergence of Urdu, whom to look for? Where to look for? And so Urdu derives its forms, genres. Talk of ghazal, talk of qasida, talk of ayham goi, talk of, dual meaning, poetry, talk of elegies. They all are forms of Persian poetry that was taken into. And the learning and getting influence is a natural process. To say that Persian also received when the Arabs conquered the area, the Persian inherited the Arabic poetry. So in the poetry of Anwari, Khaqani, Rudaki, a number of one, you will find the influence of Arabic in the Persian. And the Persian are so snobbish about their language, repository, etc., that they won't be believing in the others. But not to say that they were not influenced by the Arabs, nonetheless. So they were influenced, and of course Urdu derived its major thing from. And Urdu never, and to say that Urdu not only derived things from Persian, but also from, Braj from Delhi Register, from Haryanavi to Gujarati to Dakkani. It is not a foreign language as such. It is the Hindustani, the language of not Muslims, I would say, which these days are continuously perceived to be associated with the Muslims, but it is the language of the Indians. So you will find Awadhi, Braj into it, Mathili also you will find, and so regional variation. Even if you go to Chennai, you will find influences. Of course, Bengali also, you will find the taking and giving away of it. So one aspect about it. About the de-Ashrafization. So I do not see it in that context. These are the geographical, thing that is taking place. So it is not to say that when somebody says that Dehlavi, it means that he is from Delhi or Gwaliari, Shattari. What I, during my research, I came to know about is that there was influence of Gwaliari, Braji, Dehlavi, etc. on these scholars. And so I won't see it through the prism of, de-Ashrafization as such. Because once again, he traces in this paper I was talking about the Ataris of Nishapur from his mother's side. So it is not that de-Ashrafization, I think. It is the elitist thing that in that terms. That's all. So hope I answered.
So I'm afraid we have gone beyond the time that was allotted to us. We are almost 10 minutes beyond the time allotted to us. So they will have to conclude our
On this side,
session.
not
I'm really sorry, but these are the instructions the organizers have given me. I can't really encroach on the time of the next session. Yeah, so you'll have to pardon me for not keeping discipline. Yeah, and I'm grateful to all our three panelists and distinguished audience for this wonderful session. Thank you so much, and we now break for tea.
I'd like to welcome you to the last session of this very interesting conference. I can see there's been a lot of interest. I hope that interest is sustained, despite the fact that, some of us have been here for a long time and are maybe a little tired. But I think we're going to have two very interesting sessions, speakers who are going to speak on very, very diverse kind of topics. And both of them, I'm sure, will be contributing a lot to the theme of the conference. So since we would all be tired by now, without my speaking, let me invite the first speaker, Namita. Okay. And she's going to be speaking on folklore traditions of Mithila. Yeah? So, knowledge production and folk literature in history, legends of Mithila. So, without further ado.
Thank you, ma'am. So, my paper actually talks about the knowledge production that takes place in Mithila in the 14th and 15th century, and folklore, of Mithila, which is seen today in the marriage rituals specifically. So one of the major challenges in studying the regional history of the medieval period in Indian context is the lack of court chronicles as found in sultanates of North India from medieval era. It is probably because the so-called Hindu dynasties had a humbler origin and they did not have a special genre called history writing. So history was being recorded in multiple genres. It is a lack of this specialized genre which existed in Europe and Islamic traditions that ultimately led the imperialist historians to say that the Indians did not have any tradition of history. But having said that, it does not mean that Indians were not recording history or did not have any mechanism to sort of record histories and political treatise or any other kind of theory in the genres that were prevalent in India around that time. So therefore, in my understanding, the accusation of lack of sense of history in India is not true. Therefore, a keen observer of the medieval period, in lack of hard historical evidences in form of wide circulation of dynastic coins or palaces or huge volume of inscriptions from humbler dynasties with their limited resources, has guided the historians of the period then to move to the literary compositions, to find traces of historical facts and evidences explaining the social relations and political formations in these regions of the period. So in the trends of change and continuity in wake of interaction of these regional dynasties with the Sultanate makes these literary compositions an interesting study from the period. In my study, in short, I would like to first point out that like any other regional dynasty of the 14th or the 15th century in India, Mithila also was not a secluded zone. Mithila comes under direct contact with the Sultanate in the 14th century, marking my period, the beginning of my study. Here, I have selected two scholars for my study, Chandeshwara Thakur, who is from 14th century, and Vidyapati from the 15th century. Their work, whether a normative text or a literary composition, presents a complex set of socio-political ideals prevalent in the region during the period. This paper attempts to understand that Vidyapati compositions probably could become part of the popular culture because they conformed to the social normatives and ideals prevalent in the period. The nature of folk is such that any written composition that is adopted and repeatedly performed amongst the masses tends to go through subtle changes in its language and narrative. Vidyapati here lived in the 15th century and composed so in the same period. And these songs can be heard even today in the various forms of cultural life of Mithila. Therefore, as a historian, it becomes a compulsion for me, and especially a medievalist, to prove that the values found today in Vidyapati's songs do contain traces of historical realities of 15th century, whether it is in social relations or political ethics. These claims cannot be made without looking into the literary or historical texts produced in the medieval period in Mithila. Therefore, I will look at Rajniti Ratnakar written by Chandeshwara Thakur, like I mentioned before, and I will be looking at a text produced by Vidyapati called Purush Pariksha, which specifically talks about the qualities of a just or a righteous man, an ideal man, so to say. So, because I am looking at two texts that directly concern with political ideals, and one of those texts, that is Rajniti Ratnakar, also claims that it is a political treatise. Therefore, the theory of kinship becomes an important aspect of discussion here. The theory of kinship revolves around the idea of rights and duties and relationship of a king to his subjects. Any study of the same, therefore, first has to sort of, if you're approaching a subject like theory of kinship, you have to assume that the word Raja used in these texts would mean the same as king in English. But when I looked at these texts more closely, I realized that the folk songs or the literary texts also, or political treatise as well from this period, has multiple connotations to the word Raja. It has a lot of meaning and value system attached to the term Raja. I looked into that through a couple of verses in Rajni Ratnakar, and then I go on to investigate the stories of Vidyapati, and then I also look at how the term Raja has been used, or the kind of depiction of Rajas that have been done in the folks of Mithila. That is pretty much what I am going to do in my following paper. Going on, it seems, in Mithila, texts have used the term Raja for a person, or an idea of a person who's prosperous, or an upholder of Hindu Dharma. Therefore, a prosperous and morally upright conduct was seen as qualities inseparable from the idea of Raja. This Raja could be a ruler, as mentioned in some of the literary texts dealing with the subject matter of political theory, like that of Rajniti Ratnakar. He could also be a suitable match for a daughter of a father looking for an eligible bachelor for his daughter of a marriageable age. Or he could also be a dutiful citizen of a village who has enough land to have a comfortable existence in a village setup of medieval times. For example, let's look at a verse from Rajniti Ratnakar, which is a verse placed right at the introduction of the text. It says, I'm going to read just the first two lines of the Sanskrit verse that is given, and which is long. It says, Raja Namavi Visheshan Nijgad Manuhpura. What he's trying to say here is that Manu Smriti, the text Manu Smriti, he's quoting that text. He says Manu has already explained the qualities of a Raja, but in order to, eliminate any kind of confusion, that is, Visheshanev Vakshyami Sanshayo Na Yatha Bhavetu, in order to eradicate any kind of confusion that may be left, I therefore define the qualities of a Raja in nutshell. The translation, therefore, indicates that the kings are of three kinds. The first is a samrat, who collects taxes from other rajas on regular basis. He, according to Chandeshwara, is a Chakravartin. The second kind of Raja is a tax-paying individual, one who dutifully pays his monthly and annual taxes regularly. And the third is a non-tax-paying individual, the one who pays taxes willfully in form of gifts. The above description explains that, in my understanding, that is that Chandeshwara Thakur's description of Raja defies the idea of, power and authority attached to the figure of Raja, while his duties towards the state become the prime indicator of his Raja status. The humble acceptance of the coexistence of Samrat-like figures in the same verse and Raja as well in the same para shows the acceptance of regional elite status of Mithila kings. And if not so, then he definitely is accepting the fact that there were Rajas with various levels of hierarchies present in that time period. Any detailed study of the nature of power difference between the three types of Raja is not the scope of this paper. However, I will move on and talk about Chandeshwara Thakur clarifying that the code of conduct associated to the figure of Raja was not restricted to the royal princes. So after he gives the introductory verse, he goes on to explain that the kind of Raja definitions he's giving in his verse, as it is, clarifies that the Raja that he's talking about is a Raja who could be anybody who's, is aspiring to create an ideal living for himself, and therefore it is not for an individual, the head of the state or so. It is a category that could have more than one person as part of the Raja category. Chandeshwara Thakur is not alone in, propagating such ideals for an individual to follow. Therefore, we'll be looking at other, writer as well under question in the paper, in the same paper. But I would like to quote Foucault here. He says that the meaning of a language is conditioned by social structure, culture, and discourse. And therefore, search for knowledge will invariably take a researcher to the centers of power. In other words, according to Foucault, knowledge, power, and truth in any given period is interrelated. On similar lines, I'm attempting to show that the normative prevalent in high culture literary texts of Mithila also find glimpses in its folk culture. For example, I'm quoting a marriage folk song which is sung in Mithila, and this is actually a collection from Ram Iqbal Rakesh's book, which is a slightly older collection of Mithila folk. It says, Angan Bohrai Siya Debi Cheer Samhrai, आंगन सिया आहे सिया भेली व्याहन जोग सिया जोग वर चाही रानी पूछे राजा सोचे मन पछताए आहे सिया भेली व्याहन जोग सिया जोग वर चाही. So in short, it is a dialogue between a mother and Sita's father, where the mother is telling the father as to how Sita is now of marriageable age, following which her father, is worried, and he sends a message to the local priest, who in turn heads out to look for a perfect groom for her. He reaches Ayodhya, where he tells Raja Dashrath of Ayodhya about the eligible bride, and Raja of Ayodhya readily agrees and immediately proceeds towards Mithila with his sons. Well, on one hand, the song has a dominant Mithila identity prevalent today that claims that, Mithila is Sita's birthplace. Investigating that, of course, is not scope of this paper. But every Mathil marriage song talks, every other, folk song prevalent in Mithila around the marriage rituals talks of Ram-Sita-like marriage, highlighting the aspirational hope for every couple in the region. While Sita's father is addressed as Raja here in this song, the daughter, therefore the princess, is shown to be engaged in a menial household labor, like, in this case, brooming her angan or courtyard, as one would call it. But in order to, further prove my point, I want to use another folk song that is sung in the Mithila region around marriage rituals. This is Dasrath approaching Janak with a marriage proposal. So the song goes, Palanga sutal aho raja he Dasrath, sunu raja vachan hamar he, janm beetal raja eko nahi paulo morughar ram kumar he, झीने झीने कपड़ा पहिरू राजा दशरथ ले लिए घोड़ा असवार. I want to move down to the last few sentences which are of importance here, is that, after the king heads out to look for an eligible bride, he has to travel long distance in harsh weather conditions, and that has been explained as ek kos gela raja doi kos gela tesre mein lagal piyas hai ehi nagariya mai hai koi nahi jagal churu e paniya piyao hai. As in, he's been walking long distance in harsh weather, and he finds nobody to even give him a glass of water. And as he reaches Mithila, he finds water, and then Sita's father asks him for his well-being, and after that Sita's father asks him the purpose of his visit. This is so what is happening here is that he is greeted by the father first, and then, asked for water and is offered water, and then asked for his well-being, and then asked for the purpose of his visit. Here, the status of Raja, is more about the moral conduct, the humane attitude of the family of Sita in Mithila, because, he goes ek kos, do kos, or teen kos, or nobody asks him for water. But as soon as he reaches Mithila, the first thing that people do is offer him a glass of water. This is an effort of showing how Mithila's cultural or humane angle was much higher morally or ethically than the other regions. And in order to better understand the social values of the region, Chandeshwara's political treatise Rajniti Ratnakar is again referred to here. But before we move on to the details of the specific prose, it is important to discuss the nature and context of his book and the discussion. So Rajniti Ratnakar is a mature composition by Chandeshwara like I said, in 14th century. It is neatly arranged in 16 sections. Namely, he uses the term nirupan. So, which means, classifying the qualities of a king, and then subsequently of a minister, of a commander. So in lack of time, I'm going to only present the crux of my paper now. I'll have to rush through. However, in short, so what happens is that when Chandeshwara is writing, he's writing in a period where he was ruling, so he was composing under the king Harisimh Dev, and around the same time Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq attacks Mithila, forcing the king, his patron, and him to flee to Nepal. And he could not return to Mithila until the Oinwara dynasty was established. What is important again for one to note here is that Oinwara, so we have had in early medieval context, we've had important discussions, or even in medieval period, we've had important discussions by B.D. Chattopadhyay or Norman Ziegler about evolution of political institutions, formation of political families, and this kind of socio-political formation is not taking place in Mithila here when change of power takes place. Oinwaras are actually vassals to the Sultanate, and their legitimacy actually comes from the fact that they were erstwhile priests of the Karnata dynasty, to which Harisimha Deva belonged. Moving on, this is where I want to bring in Vidyapati Thakur now, because there's lack of time, though the paper is quite descriptive and long. What I am trying to show here is that Purush Pariksha is a text which is being written a century later, which is in the 15th century. Now, in Purush Pariksha, in its introduction, starts with the claim that it is a book which is being written for a father who's looking for an eligible groom who could be a just or a righteous man. But as you move further into the book, you realize that it under the garb of looking for a right or eligible boy for the marriage, it is also actually a political, ethical sort of normative for the youngsters to follow. In fact, Vidyapati in his introduction also mentions that it is a book which is being written for the young adults to follow the path of Nyay. Nyay here is, again, righteous living. Chandeshwara Thakur, in another stanza, goes on to, in another verse says that, so from Raja, we are moving towards the qualities of an ideal man, and between the two, the Raja and the qualities of an ideal man, there is one aspect that has been extensively worked on in other regions of India, especially Gujarat, Malwa, or the Deccan, which is Ramya Srinivasan or Aparna Kapadia have extensively worked on the warrior-like quality. When I was looking at that warrior-like quality attached to the figure of Raja or to the idea of a right or righteous or a just young man, I realized that because Vidyapati and Chandeshwara Thakur both have experienced a period where they have faced attacks from the sultanates of North Delhi, they both realize the horrors of the war. So when I reach the chapter in Chandeshwara's Rajniti Ratnakar, which talks about war conditions, when should a king wage war, he says in his verses, and I'm only using the translation here because we have lack of time, it says, an all-conquering king should aim at winning over all the confidants of his adversaries to know all the secrets of his enemies. Only after he has learned all the secrets should he wage war. He should use all diplomatic tactics. To be specific, he says, Sham, Dam, Dand, Bhed, to win over enemies, and should not try to win only by war, because a full-fledged armed confrontation may lead to victory of the either side. Therefore, war should always be avoided at all costs. Similarly, when we look at, Vidyapati's Purush Pariksha, and I'm only going to discuss that part and I'm going to leave the rest and conclude my paper here, is that when Vidyapati is talking about valor, and I am using G.A. Grayerson's translation. In his introduction in verse 10, he says, a hero is a man who is graced with valor, with discretion, and with energy. In verse 11, he goes on to explain what valor is. Valor for Vidyapati is freedom from poorness of spirit. Discretion for him is appreciation of the difference between suitable and its reverse. Energy is perseverance, and these three qualities constitute a hero. What I am saying is both of these writers are using a word of caution as far as war is concerned. Now, quickly moving on to the next aspect of Vidyapati's Purush Pariksha, there is a particular chapter which talks about adepts of war, of arms. So when he's talking about how a king should know the sort of art of war, king should be skilled in arms. The story that follows that particular chapter, because Purush Pariksha is a neatly collection of stories where the characters are fictional. So when he moves to adepts of arms, so in his story he gives a description of a Brahmin boy who gets stuck on a temple top in trying to destroy a nest of a group of pigeons. And as he puts his hand into the wall, hole to get hold of the pigeon nest, he ends up entangling a snake in his hand, and now he's scared, and he's hanging onto the rooftop with another hand with a snake in one of his hands, and the message reaches the Raja. The Raja here is Bhoj, Raja Bhoj, and names used in the book are also interesting, but we'll look into that later. So what happens here is that the Raja feels the pain of this Brahmin boy, and saving a Brahmin's life is the biggest good deed you can do in your line to get more punya to your kitty. So, but then what happens here is that Raja actually announces a hefty award to whoever rescues the boy. Interestingly enough, a Rajput volunteers. This Rajput is an excellent example of an archer, and he sort of rescues the boy. Having said that, what was interesting for me to note is that all the articles we read from the medieval period that have worked on regional dynasties sort of mix all the three together: Raja, warrior-like quality, and Rajput. All of the three come together in certain regions. Here, the Raja is not necessarily skilled in archery. There could be two explanations of the same. We all know that Oinwara dynasty is actually a Brahmin dynasty. It's not a Rajput dynasty. That's one. The second thing is probably archery was not a skill that a king necessarily had to learn. It was probably too low in the order. It could be anything. I'm only speculating that. Having said that, the entire paper actually tries to sort of reach a conclusion where I'm trying to understand that a man like Vidyapati, who was creating songs on one hand and creating royal biographies and texts like Purush Pariksha on the other hand, may have sort of passed on his his worldview, his perceptions about political ethics, his understanding about morality, and into his songs, which was later shared by the folk traditions of Mithila as well. And with that, I will conclude my paper.
I would like to invite Dr. Dhiraj Kumar Nitte to speak on labor practices, remuneration and levels of living, the Indian subcontinent over quite a large period, 1600 to 1870. Dr. Dhiraj Kumar Nitte.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I must express my acknowledgement of my friend Amit and director of NMML to invite me and all of us to this interesting conference. This is an opportunity for me to share with you one of my new areas of interest, and in fact your feedback and input will be very welcome to help me to shape it in the future. So far I had worked on later 19th century and the 20th century. For last a few years, I would say 2 years now, I have been thinking of developing a very ambitious line of inquiry. That's a history of welfare and history of well-being on one side, and history of policy. So policy history and well-being history together. And bits and pieces of these two concerns have been examined by a large number of scholars, but we don't have consistent account of these things. And I'm trying to develop work on this, and I'm sure all of you would contribute to it. So this is one of the preliminary papers that I'm sharing with you, alongside two other papers that I have also worked on in tandem with this. That's the economic part. Here I'm sharing with you cultural, intellectual part. So There are two analytical questions that I am examining here. That is the connection between the levels of living of the working people on one side and the labor institutions and discursive practices during 1600 and 1870 on the other. Now you may wonder that why 1600 to 1870? Now most of the Indian historians know that this period has by and large described as early modern period, starting from the late 15th century by a good number of scholars in last 20 years, and then it transitions into the colonial modernity from the early 18th century. And why 1870? 1870 can be flexibly moved here and there, but there is a very famous work by Williamson, Geoffrey Williamson, Trade and Poverty, and then many other articles that he wrote, where he finds that 1870 was the starting point of the great globalization, the boom in trade of primary commodity, which he slightly revisited in his recent book, but I am still maintaining this 1870 as the period following which there was definitely the price inflation in the Indian economy connected with the globalization boom that took place, especially in the primary commodity. So let me come to some larger concerns in which I locate this inquiry. So for last 20 years, 25 years now, a good number of scholars have been debating what is known as the Great Divergence. The Great Divergence that took place, as per the account of many scholars in case of India, like Siv Ramakrishnan and Prasanna Parsathi, who wrote a very famous book, Why Europe Grew Rich, Asia Not. Say in case of China, the starting point was by the Kenneth Pomeranz. The title of the book is The Great Divergence. It says that unlike the old view, celebrating European exceptionalism, actually until the 18th century, the level of development and the standard of living in northwestern Europe on one side and the old civilization in Asia were at par with each other, comparable with each other. That's the argument. And the divergence occurred only in the early 19th century as a follow-up of the colonization of these economies. And in fact, many of them use the Angus medicines statistical data created in 30, 40 years from the World Bank, whereby they have come up with celebratory figure like that India formed 24% of the world GDP until 1800. China was controlling around 30%, 32% of the world GDP until 1800, and then there was a massive downfall in the 19th century, early 20th century, then reconvergence started only after the independence. Now, there has been challenge to this view by many scholars, including some Indian scholars like Vishnu Priya Gupta, who wrote very famous essay on this subject in Explorations in Economic History in 2015, and there are others who say that yes, there was the convergence in the standard of living and level of economic development until the middle of the 17th century. So now the line of the date has been shifted back to 1650s, that is middle of the 17th century, and then divergence started in the later half of the 17th century. So that means before the colonization, there was already the onset of divergence. That means the upper hand of the European, Western European economy on one side and the downswing in the old Asian civilizations. And Vishnu Priya Gupta and Stephen Broadberry have marshaled massive amount of quantitative data to present this argument. This argument has been supported by also Geoffrey Williamson in his book Trade and Poverty, where in fact he identifies the beginning of deindustrialization, especially in the textile sector in the very later 18th centuries. For instance, again there is a celebratory figure regarding the contribution of textile to the world economy, that by 1750s India contributed something around 25% of the textile of the world, whereas by 1800 it was producing around 6%, 5%, varying different statistical figure. But there was massive decline in the very later 18th century. It means the industrial revolution in the textile in England was not necessarily responsible for, or the consolidation of the colonial economy was not necessarily responsible for the downswing in the significant role of the Indian manufacturing to the world economy until the middle of the 18th century. Now, apart from the statistical account and differences on that, there is very interesting similarity on the theoretical framework applied by both supporter and opponents of this view on Great Divergence. All of them follow two kinds of theoretical model. One is by Nobel Prize winner Douglas North, who wrote a very famous book that I'm sure all of you would be familiar with, that Understanding the Process of Economic Change, published in 2005, but he had received Nobel Prize for another book in 1994 itself. And then Asmaglu and Robinson, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity and Poverty. So basically they say, and which all these scholars have applied, who say that Indian economy was growing and was at par with the Northwestern Europe, which is, by the way, very contradictory to what Irfan Habib had said in the potentialities of the capitalist development, where he found out no existence of the potentialities of capitalist transformation. But all of them challenged Irfan Habib and others to present, but the arguments why there was economic growth is as follows. There was the supportive institutions in existence in the old Asian civilization. What are these supportive institutions? They have picked up from these scholars. One, the security of private property. The second, the existence of mechanism of contract enforcement. Third, the constraint and plural power structure, which is opposite to Asiatic despotism thesis. And fourth, the rule of law. Again, it is opposed to the colonial stereotype about the Asian civilization, that the absence of rule of law. So all these four institutional arrangements which are known in the modern world, responsible for promoting economic growth, existed in the Indian civilization, and in case of Kenneth Pomeranz, in case of Chinese civilization, from the 16th century and definitely from the 17th century onwards. Now, if you statistically look at and then raise some question, then you will come across this situation. This is the one graph that I am showing you, and I will raise some of the questions. That you will see that yes, GDP was growing till 1800, and it fell down only from the turn of the 19th century. And GDP figure is this line you can see. It was growing till 1800, and then it downswing occurred, and then recovery happened largely from the 1840s onwards, and that was then a stagnation, and from 1870 onwards there was the consistent rise. But parallel to that means this is about the thesis of growth. But parallel to that, what you see is that real GDP per capita income, which is the indicator of the quality of, one of the indicators of the quality of life, that was already falling down in this period. So GDP per capita is this one, green one. You can see that even though GDP was growing, GDP per capita was coming down. Then in early 19th century, it stagnated, then recovery happened from 1850s, and then a stagnation till 1871. Then further, it was growth. So that means GDP was growing till 1800, then decreased. That means colonial consolidation definitely adversely affected. But per capita income was falling down even during the period of the growth of the economy. That means population was growing higher than the growth in the material economy. Why? Next slide is central to our discussion. the ratio of wage and per capita was actually falling faster. Wage, this is the figure. This was, if you compare it with the previous figure, you will find that this fall was faster till 1811. It means inequality was increasing. The share of working population, including peasantry here, because that was the largest component of the working population, and was falling down in the total national income. And that's why you can easily see here wage GDP ratio, which was falling much faster here. Now, then what accounts for and what meaning it brings to us if we counterpose this increasing inequality and decreasing share of the working population in the total national income, when the economy was definitely growing. So that means if we put them together, the question before us will be that growth may not necessarily bring prosperity to the working population, to the productive classes. And that means we should not just look for explanations for growth, but also look for explanation of increasing inequality and falling share in the national income of the working population. Now, before I proceed, let me read to you one of the intellectual currents of the modern world to further progress our discussion. Jyotiba Phule, that all of you know as one of the leading social reformers of modern India, and he wrote in 1869, the Malis and Kunbis labor, these are the peasant caste in central India, Deccan region. The Malis and Kunbis labor in the fields and pay the taxes. They don't even get clothes to cover their bodies. Tiny little children tend the cattle. They have no shoes, their feet are bare, they have no time to learn anything. Your importance for education as a theme of our discussion. They have no time to learn anything. The father is in anguish. See, he blames the gods for his misfortune. He who goes to school, the teacher mistreats and neglects him. This is, and Jyotiba Phule, his wife Savitri Phule, are remarkable personalities of modern India. For the first time, we see in the galaxy of social reformer and religious reformer, to include the question of caste, the question of class, the question of labor, and the question of education were put together. You cannot have any comparison of this kind of view in any social reform currents preceding this. None of the currents of the social reform movement brought together all these questions, all these concerns. And I can give you a plethora of quotes from Kabir to Ravidas to Surdas to Gujarati social reformer Ako Bhagat to Satnamis to Sikh, anything. None of them put together all these concerns at one place. And in particularly education. I am glad that yesterday I had informative conversation with Amit, who informed me that how until the 1830s all villages in eastern India had Pathsala and all that. But educational concern, that how the vast majority of the working Indian population, and you remember that by 1870s India was ruralized and peasantized, so that 3/4 of the Indian population were the rural population, and it was so much heavily rural agrarian economy, and their children had little opportunity to education because of institutional constraint or because of the livelihood pattern they were pursuing. And furthermore, they were discriminated or they were mistreated or neglected. Now, my inquiry in the rest of the paper is to trace the genealogy of this kind of critique with this two conceptual intervention. What I presented to you about the new institutional economic model or new institutional economic framework, they lack two things. Two things to my judgment. There are other critics also. One, there is an absence of the role of labor ideologies in their model. And I will tell you how significant would be if we integrate that in our focus. The labor ideologies. What role did the labor ideologies play in shaping of the pattern of economic development? The second, there is necessity, which Douglas North, Asmaglu Robinson have actually captured, but Indian historians who applied that model to a study of South Asian economy have so far not done. There is a necessity to look at the self-activity and concern for entitlement as it existed among the productive classes themselves. We do have the study of the social reform movement, okay, and campaign, social reform campaign, etc. Like if you read a famous book by Irfan Habib, Medieval India, published by Medieval India, subtitle is very interesting. A study of civilization. For the first time after Didi Kosambi, Irfan Habib highlighted this point. Many students I talked to in Medieval India, I'm not from Medieval India specialization, but they miss this point. Irfan Habib Kosambi way back in 1953, when he wrote book Introduction to Indian Civilization and Culture, that was the study of civilization. Then Irfan Habib revisited that. Anyway, there is a chapter on religion, there is a chapter on social structure and class struggle, and you will see a whole range of references to social reform movement, etc. But not the way that I am proposing to make it here. Now, let's I have 5 minutes. So let me just quickly sum up. I am giving you 2 examples of the labor ideologies playing an important role. One, in the period of Akbar came up with 2 injunctions, important injunctions. One, he prohibited the use of unpaid labor. And the second, in case of South Indian kingdoms came up with what Vijay Ramaswamy wrote, that they, for the first time, discontinued the tradition coming down from the Dharma Shastra time. What was the tradition? That all the artisans would pay one day unfree labor in a month to the nobility and aristocracy. It was the tradition since the Dharma Shastra time, that is the 300 to 500 BC time onwards. And in the 15th, 16th century, the South Indian kingdoms discontinued that. Furthermore, this emphasis on prohibition on the use of unpaid labor played an important role alongside the role played by monetization and commercialization of the economy that is well known, which gave flip to the industrious effort of the artisanal class. As a result, if you look at the wage inequality between artisan and the sweat laborers, that is unskilled laborers, you will be startled to note that India was exceptionally in high skill premium, causing wage inequality. In China and England, around this time period, 16th to 18th century, wage inequality between the artisan and sweat laborer was 50%. In India, it was 150% to 200%. Now, why? This is the next question. Another labor ideology. The same Akbar and the same Mughal rulers maintained the policy of excluding the untouchables and the Sudras from the ownership of the private property. And Irfan Habib gives different estimates. At some place, he gives that 1/6 of the total rural population were excluded from the ownership of property. At another place, he gives the estimate of 25%. So between, let's say 20%, between that, and 20% of the rural population were excluded from the ownership in order to create and maintain the supply of cheap labor in the countryside to the service of the landed gentry. And what a very famous scholar, Deepak, I'm forgetting the surname, who wrote the book Hindu Equilibrium, where he celebrated this kind of exclusion as the second Pareto optimum mechanism maintained by the Indian civilization. So we can celebrate exclusionary in order to maintain the growth also. But that caused that inequality and exceptionalism of Indian civilization in terms of the wage inequality that existed. And therefore, you had this falling share of the unskilled workers in the national income. Even though, if you just study the artisanal laborer, you may be happy to note that their real wage was at par with the Europeans. And then misconception that we were as developed as the northwestern European economies. Let me go to the next, self-activity and entitlement struggle, and I will end with that. This was not sufficient factor, these labor ideologies I told you. There was a constant assertion made by the different artisanal castes, peasant groups, to claim their right in this period. So let me give you just one example. The Satnamis. The Satnamis now, they are in preponderance in Chhattisgarh region, but in the 16th century their movement, in the 17th century their movement had started actually for Haryana, and they had revolted in 1657 in Haryana. Satnamis emphasized on two important concepts which many social reformers did not capture. One, that they should have right to legitimate livelihood, and their dignity should be considered on the basis of their laboring contribution, not their caste position. This is in league with what Jyotiba Phule is here developing by including many other concerns. And then you do have in the same link among the artisanal group Ravidas, who took up from Kabir and argued the same point, that the dignity should not be associated with the caste position. It should come with the material significance of the contribution made by the individual in society and economy. They were all asserting and making an expression of the fact that artisanal community were benefiting, of course, and another fact that in this period, even though the untouchables, the Sudras, were excluded from the property ownership, but subterranean history of South Asia is that their assertion and their struggle contributed to the expansion of the land in this period. If you look at the record of the land expansion captured by Irfan Ayub and David Ludden, you will find that what land was under cultivation in 1901 as per the census, 40 to 50% of that was under cultivation in 1600, and between 1600 and 1800 there was 50% increase, and this 50% increase was one of the forces responsible for this land expansion was the role played by these groups from the peasant caste to claim their entitlement, to fight back the caste-based exclusion. And what does mean by fighting back the caste-based exclusion? Basically exclusion from the entitlement to the property, exclusion from the self-respect. And that contributed to that expansion which we see in terms of the growth of the economy, but the institutional deprivation imposed on them was the source of their falling share in national income. Let me just end with this. The same tradition also expressed itself in the early 19th century, when the economy was clearly in downswing, when for the first time in modern time, the wage rate was below the subsistence between 1800 and 1850s, 1860s, and that is studied by Robert Allen, that how for the first time Indians' wage was below subsistence wage in this period. But here we also see the emergence of, for instance, a movement by the Nam Sudras in Bengal. The Bengal was the first province where the land expansion happened under the new revenue and land settlement. In the rest of the India, it started only after the 1840s, because after the land settlement, the first was dislocation and disruption and the fall in the land under cultivation. The Bengal recovered first because land revenue took place first, and from the 1820s, 40s, 25 onwards, there was a recovery as studied by Sugata Bose. And this recovery was on the shoulder of the Namsudras who were deployed by the Jotedar to open up the forest land, banner land, and Marsi land. And these Namsudras once became peasantized and grew. They were previously Chandal but now claimed Namsudras in the later 19th century, and now they are very strong political stakeholder in the Indian democracy. This is studied by Sekhar Bandhopadhyay. So let me stop here. I welcome your comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nite and Namita, for very interesting and very different presentations. We have 10 minutes for questions, so since we have only 10 minutes for questions, if you could keep these as questions, it would be really nice and would really help in a lot of people actually asking questions. Given the paucity of time, is it possible that we kind of ask the questions and then they can respond, collectively, so to speak? So, questions.
I have one query and one question. Here, first of all, a query that what is the database? This is the biggest issue because it's such a large period, and all of us know that this has been usual query. Being a labor historian, you know well that informal labor is still a issue as far as data is concerned. This is the query. And question is, Sumit Guha 5 years back commented that state has been the biggest stakeholder in social suppression of wages in India. And that is why caste system has been maintained since antiquity till date. Whether it was ancient Mauryan, Gupta, Sultanate, or Mughals, or Britishes, or even post-colonial state, ruling classes have always ensured that wages should not be economically suppressed, but they should be socially suppressed. And that is why caste has been maintained. So how you will respond to this?
Professor D.
I have queries, very brief queries. I will just listen to the instruction of the chair. So first to Nomita, wonderful paper. But I was wondering whether we can have a larger canvas, larger perspective. For example, there is a sharing of spiritual space and also political space. For example, when you mentioned that there was a process of emulating a perfect man, that is interesting aspect. That is also common among the Sufis. They look for an insan-e kamil, the perfect man. That is one aspect. And I also was intrigued by the evolution of the term and its connotation and implications of Raja. Now, spiritual elements often borrow such terms. Sometimes they pose themselves as a competitor of the political authority. For example, you will find in Sufi literature, this term was used by the followers of Nizamuddin Auliya, Sultanul Mashaikh. Mashaikh is a spiritual term, but he is the Sultan of all the sheikhs. For example, if you go to other religious orders, even today, for example, Ramakrishna Mission, the very successful, those who are in the hierarchy, top of the hierarchy, they are known as Maharaja. So whether we can think in these lines, it's a competitive term. And also, the Sultan is also projected in official biographies, official history. That this is a very, for example, Al-Tamash is a very pious Sultan. He is as if he is being compared with a very pious Sufi saint. So this is one aspect. Regarding the munificent or philanthropic aspect also, there is also sharing. Even today you will find that in Sikhism, distribution of drinking water is very common. And that's why you will find that well or talab or pond, they are being sanctified in Sufi literature. So distribution of water to the musafir. In the langar, where langar are organized, it is written, don't ask people about the religion. Ask the musafir whether he or she is hungry or thirsty. So these are certain aspects we can incorporate probably, so that we can understand the sharing of spiritual as well as political space. Regarding Dhiraj, it was very interesting. I'm calling you following the American style. You are speaking about globalization, your first name. I should not have done that. But anyway, that facilitates friendship. that facilitates friendship. And anyway, Now, you mentioned about the land reclamation aspect, but that started in the 16th century with the eco-geographical perspective when the river was moving eastwards. Then this reclamation of marshy land took place, and in 1575, Akbar politically controlled Bengal, and there was a direct water route from northern India to Bengal, and that facilitated Akbar's maximization of revenue from Bengal. So this sort of movement towards the east, movement of the river towards the east, reclamation of marshy land, that took place during that period, and Richard Eaton is just identifying that phase with a process of Islamization, this eco-geographical change. So when you say that it was happening in the 18th century or British period, that acquired a new dimension, but it had an earlier history.
Yeah, this.
So very brief question or comment, howsoever you take it, to the first speaker, Namita. Following your presentation, I get the impression that you it is going in a little problematic direction, in a sense that the high culture is guiding the low culture or the folk culture. Yeah, so that impression is coming, and this is a kind of unidirectional. So what Chandeswar Thakur is doing, what Vidyapati is doing, the kind of ideals they are promoting, that we can locate through the folk songs, even of later period. So to avoid that, one should reread A.K. Ramanujan's folklore essay, appeared in Manusi, really available. I say this because you discussed that marriage songs in Mithila. So equally, as is Siya Ram's Sita Ram, or rather Ram Janki is there in Mithila, so is the song of Shiva and Parvati marriage is sung. Yeah, so I would rather read those kind of songs in a specific way. See, basically it's the everyday life of people and its take on those songs. That's the first layer. How is it related to the larger, say, question of patriarchy, or for that matter, the state and its patriarchy and so forth? That's the second order question. You may privilege that, but yeah, so these things should be clarified. Polemical point I want to ask, or rather raise. So if the land reclamation is seen as kind of a progressive, it is read progressively, that liberation of the artisans or the, say, deprived classes. So it would, say, feed into Ram Guha and Gadgil's thing that the ecological caste has, or caste restrictions had its ecological side to it.
Okay, Ashutosh, Nilesh, Professor Farooqi, and I think then we'll have to just stop because we won't have any time for answers. So I will take
have a small question.
No, sir, please. No.
I have a small question to Dheeraj. Thanks for a very nice paper. Actually, I learned a lot. So, this social economic inequality of the 17th and 16th, 17th, 18th century might lead to this international labor market in which these North Indian laborers or South Indian laborers incorporated themselves and left out or went overseas. But why, only of this North Indian UP Bihar mostly, and the South Indian Tamil Nadu and Madras areas laborers only connected themselves or got into this 19th century international labor market, particularly to the overseas labor market of Kangani Mestri or indenture system, and not from across the country? because if, I mean, according to your argument, it's all India level, the data which you show. But why these two only limited areas people connected themselves or, left the country to get better wages or whatever the better life, something?
Thank you. I'll be quick as well. Thank you to both of you for wonderful papers. To Dhiraj, just to follow up on the question about regional differentiation, in your overview of the divergence debates, you didn't mention Kaveh Yazdani's recent work, which aims to address this question of regional differentiation in India vis-a-vis Mysore and Gujarat and parts of the West, and I think it could follow from the earlier discussion. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Professor Farooqi, a question? Okay. Yeah. Yes.
The dawn of independence. But having got that reservation done for 10 years, subsequent governments continued, and still today. And I think the real break will come through if somebody, I travel sometimes by buses, mostly by, and I've yet to see a person, will somebody give me what is social equality, inequality? There was a time when you couldn't climb through the thing, and you couldn't climb a palanquin, but an odd case here and there may be coming up, and I think the press today is exaggerating those things and saying that no progress has been made. So this, and I predict, I am a student of governance, or management you call it, or whatever called public administration, and with 40, 50 years experience, from pre-independence to post-independence, up to the time to cut off with the last elections, last but one. And unless the government of the day comes out and have a one go, if somebody has the courage to reserve all reservations. I can understand Jagjeevan Ram, but not his daughter, who is a member of the Foreign Service, getting so many. I can see people claiming in the Right to Education Act, coming in SUVs, claiming that meager amount which the government has got for the rations. So this is totally bogus in my mind, and I think the death knell came when the partidars claim.
So your question,
but
sir?
This is the question, that somebody, it's very easy to comment social inequality there. Will somebody give an example of social inequality in this audience or later on even?
Sir. Last quick question? Yeah. All right. So, I think Dheeraj can answer first and then Namita can take it up.
Okay. So, firstly to Professor Day. It's an ongoing work. The paper that I presented is a portion of an ongoing work. There is a specific section where I am actually dealing with the folk songs related to gods and the kind of motifs that are being used in those folks and the kind of message that is being sent via them. Therefore, I am also dealing with the spiritual angle, but that is not part of this paper here. I'm looking at not so much as the concept of Raja there, but I will definitely look into that direction as well. But I am looking at other aspects of Mithila society, or the kind of sort of narrative they have around their relationship with the gods in their folk songs. Of course, because I am in my work also looking at Mithila painting later. I am looking at the fish motifs. I am looking at importance of pond in this region, and I am looking at the caste-specific motif. I am looking at color-specific division with respect to the Mithila painting in the region. So yes, all that is part of my work, but not part of this paper as of now. Dr. Kumar, to answer your question, yes, you're right in what you're saying, and yes, I have gone through the songs, specifically marriage songs that are about Uma and Shiv, and in those songs, Shiv has been presented as a dark-skinned or an old man, or a man who's coming on ox, and I've gone through those songs, and that particular section was part of my paper. But that is what happens when you cut out portions of your paper in order to sort of quickly conclude it. But yes, I am aware of Ramanujan's work as well, and no, I was not trying to say that high culture values are moving in unidirectional way towards folk. It is a sharing that is happening. What I am basically the entire idea of working on this kind of a topic came from the fact that every time that I said that I want to use some of this folk material to understand the medieval period, the most important question that was thrown my way was, how will you justify the folk that is prevalent today, had the same values even in the medieval period, because it is subject to change. And therefore, this was an attempt to put the two together. And Uma Parvati stories have been looked at even in the last section of this paper, which I sort of skipped. It's an attempt to understand whether what was happening in the medieval period and is reflected in the texts composed in this period is also somehow reflected, if not in the narration style, because that could change with time, at least even in the words or the language to some extent that is being used in the folk today. That was the only limited attempt I was making. But of course, the observations are well taken here.
Namita, sorry to interrupt, but when you're talking about marriage, say you had once mentioned about idealizing the Ram-Sita marriage, and you're talking also about how the past idioms are reflected or transmuted in the present. But there is popular knowledge in Mithila that women's marriages are not arranged by consulting the horoscope because of the ill fate that Sita met in marrying Ram. So there is also, and in the folk songs, Ram is also not idealized as God or Raja, but as a son-in-law. And there is a lot of resentment expressed in the folk songs of Mithila against the bridegroom's family. So how do you incorporate?
You're actually making the same point that I was trying to make by looking into these folks, that even though one part of these songs sort of are signaling that it is the hope of the girl's family to find a son-in-law like Ram, but at the same time, when you closely look into these songs, and when you keep on looking at the folk songs, the more folk songs you look at, the more you realize that the moral conduct of Ram, in terms of him being able to uphold the Hindu Dharma, is more important, of being kind is more important than him being a good husband. Interestingly enough, like I said, sir, I'm actually dealing with that aspect later in my paper. It is also the same in Uma Parvati's case. When even in those songs, the tone and the tenor that have been used in these songs is actually very, if not insulting, then offensive to the boy's family or the boy himself. Time and again it is being reiterated as to how Uma will, live with a man like that. He looks such a way. Uma is a beautiful girl. And things like that. So yes, I'm actually moving in that direction that you mentioned. Sir, like I said, I'm only trying to understand as to why the king himself is not shown as the man who actively involves himself and rescues the boy. So, in my understanding of reading these texts, I could only reach two conclusions. The first, and both of which I presented, the first one being that probably archery was not a skill that was meant for the king. I'm just guessing. Probably. I will still have to... Not... That is, but that is for the Rajputs to know better. And we have to keep in context the fact that Vidyapati is trying to actually tell a father what a good boy actually is. And in his understanding of that particular story, that good boy is not, that suitable match is not so much as a king, but that archer, because, he can protect and he's skilled in arms. So that's what I am trying to bring forth here. I may have not presented that.
Actually, you are right. Archer.
Thanks for questions and some of the comments. Let me start with the last one, Professor Farooqi's. Potentialities. Now, I can go back to Yazdani's book, India, Modernity and the Great Divergence, 2016, which is at this moment, the latest book on this subject as far as India is concerned, where Yazdani says that, yes, there was the potentialities of capitalist transformation. As far as the two case studies, Mysore and Gujarat, are concerned, definitely in case of Gujarat, it was sound. In case of Mysore, it was frazzle. That is his judgment on the two. But there were the potentialities of capitalist transformation, and the transition to the colonial economy became an hindrance instead of unlocking the potentiality. That's which is different from Irfan Habib, and that is the latest opinion on that. And I can't say more with any sense of authority on this matter.
Irfan Habib has more recently said that I have moved closer to the Asiatic mode of production understanding of later markets.
Mm-hmm. I think that will be injurious actually to the South Asian historiography if we return back to that in light of the all new discoveries and expositions based on new sources and interpretation. Then on social inequality, I don't want to comment on reservation in this platform, because that requires a separate conference if you want to have a discussion. I am happy to present a paper on that. But let me give you just two examples of social inequality and why it matters from the thing that I presented. If the untouchables and Sudras were excluded from the property ownership in order to create the supply of cheap labor in the service of the landed gentry, is it not social inequality? If the women in South Asia were paid 50% of the wage paid to the men for the same work, was it not social inequality? And this is recorded. You can't deny as the colonial stereotype or colonial discourse created for India. So let me pass on to the rest of the other questions. Regional disparity, yes, that's a very important actually, and this is the one of the weaknesses, and I want contribution of all those who are interested in this area. The regional differences on this, however, this Prasanna Parthasarathy, after his initial study on South India, when he wrote that book, Why is Europe Grew Rich, Asia Not, he actually tried to minimize the regional differences and picked up South India, North India, Eastern and Western India all had possibly moving towards the same, had been moving towards the same direction of the growth. But the wage rates were regionally varying. For instance, South Indian wage was higher than the North Indian wage, and higher to the extent of 1/3 to 40%. Regional difference in terms of the land reclamation. See, I am not saying that land reclamation started only under the Jotidar from the 1825 onwards or 1820s onwards in Eastern India. But as I told you, between 1600 and 1800, already there was the 50% expansion of the land under cultivation. And that also included Eastern India, where it was already going. Just the Jotidar pushed the frontier further by using the Namsudras in southern India, and in south East Bengal, and in north Rajbansi and all that. Now, this on migration. See, actually I should reserve myself on this matter because I don't have sense of authority to speak on this. But one thing I can tell you that in Western India, the extent of migration was lower around this time because of one simple reason, that indigenous principalities continued to have existence for longer in Western India than the Eastern India. That may go to an extent explain this difference. Finally, this data. I think all those who are interested in it should make critical scrutiny of all database that are generated. Unfortunately, Indian scholars are not doing that. Those who are based in Indian universities are unfortunately sad to say are not doing that. They have moved to the qualitative study and making all sorts of fanciful or rigorous opinions together, but they are not doing very rigorous quantitative study. We are now, for the data, unfortunately dependent on the scholars based in Western, consisting of both Indian and Western scholars, whether Vishnupriya Gupta based in Europe or Prasanna Parthasarathy based in the US and all other. But we need to do critical. I have done one inquiry. So, for instance, around 1800, their database largely come from two reports prepared by Francis Buchanan Hamilton. One, his 3 volumes, Journey in South, that's Mysore, Kannada, and in other in Eastern India. And these volumes, which also Abhinaya Bagchi had also used in the past, there are others who have used, Shiv Ramakrishnan also used, that provide some amount of data. And the 2 other reports have been massively used, which I haven't yet consulted. One is Aini Akbari, second is the factory records of all the foreign companies working in India. That's one set. As 2 set. Third is the Pelsaret's report of 1616, who was spent time during the Jahangir. Then Bernier's report, who was spent time during Shah Jahan. These are the travelogues and reports which are massively used. But we need to actually do rigorous quantitative instead of fanciful or rigorous qualitative opinions. Thank you.
I would like to thank both the speakers, both for their presentations and for the answers, and apologize to all those who were not able to put forward their opinions and questions. So thank you so much. That concludes the presentations. We have two summations of the conference and then a vote of thanks. So I would invite first Anuba and then Shrishti to please sum up and give us a sense of what was the conference and how these papers have contributed to our knowledge. So please.
Thank you, Professor Bawa. I'm probably the only speaker in the room who would not thank Amit for giving me the opportunity to summarize. Summaries are such an onerous and probably also a little bit arrogant task. Onerous because you cannot. Summaries are summaries. It cannot be exhaustive. It cannot be representative. And arrogant, perhaps, because the kinds of stellar papers and discussions that I've encountered over the past 2 days, it's hard to capture them in a couple of lines. So with those caveats, forgive me for trying to really marshal some of the perceptions that I had, impressions that I had of the discussions as well as the papers that were presented, remarkable papers that were presented over the course of 2 days. And one of the key gestures of one of the themes of the conference was intellectual traditions and formation of knowledge in India. And as I encountered the different papers, I was wondering, one of the questions that I was left with as I encountered some of the wonderful papers was, how is historical knowledge constructed? What is peculiar to the discipline of history that promotes a certain kind of knowledge? And is that unique to the discipline of history, firstly, and is it unique, is the conjunction, the subcontinental conjunction in this scenario, the South Asian conjunction, peculiar to the kinds of things that we are discussing? Are these two things coincidental, or is there some kind of is it constructed? Is it processed? And what are the constituencies of these processes that construct historical knowledge? And to my mind, it seems to me that if history is a narrative of what happened or what has occurred, it is also a story of what did not occur. And over the course of the last 2 days, I have encountered, through your wonderful papers, different combinations and moments, ruptures and silences that have silences of history that have been wiped out from our collective imagination. And it is therefore very remarkable and gratifying for me to, because I'm not a historian by training, I studied literature, and therefore it's very gratifying for me to sit in a place and learn so much from your wonderful insights and papers. And some of the very interesting papers have agitated our commonsensical perceptions of what knowledge is in our context. Some papers highlighted how what we had known all along needed to be more inclusive to those parts of our history that we had suppressed. There were papers, and these are some of the notes that I'm reading from that I had hashed over the last 15-30 minutes. There were papers that highlighted the myriad methods through which we could understand a phenomena we all have known all along. Similarly, some papers unsettled the concepts we have been using without examining their troubled provenance. And so some of the papers have spoken to different dimensions of historiography. And I would imagine that these are not just confined to the discipline of history, but also speak to agitations, ideological and disciplinary agitations, and political agitations of other disciplines. And this is for me a very interesting conjunction. So I would just look at, I'd try and summarize the papers that were presented yesterday, and I'll then hand over to Shrishti to summarize the papers, the wonderful papers that were presented today. And like I said, I do not claim to be representative or exhaustive, so forgive me for misrepresenting, and please do correct me if I misrepresent your papers. But I'll start with the inaugural session, which was a very thought-provoking session and introduced by Professor Shakti Sinha. And some of the key themes of the conference was talked about and highlighted in the introductory session, such as what is knowledge and what are the modalities in which we know things, and what are the ideological and political constituencies of knowledge making. And I think that's a very crucial question, especially in our contemporary climate. In this context, Nita Kumar's advice to look at informal alternative sites of knowledge formation was very useful. For Kumar, the discrepancy between different models of education was also revelatory of the way modernity remains a failed project in India. And I had my own quibble with her paper, which I'll not get into. That will be terribly arrogant of me to quibble with her in her absence. But I found it useful to think of this failed modern subject and use this figure of failed modern subject as a way of thinking about why we have this education system that we have today. For her, the prescription that she left us with was we need to recover historical knowledge of India, not just from using tools enabled by modernity, but also sources and methods that have been silenced by modernity's project of historical transparency. And I think there's something to be said about why this obsession or compulsion towards historical transparency needs to be unpacked and examined in the Indian context. Similarly, Faisal Devji, which was a very different paper, a very different approach to South Asian historiography, Faisal Devji reminds us of Gandhi's own resistance to modernity masquerading as imperialism and also humanism. For Devji, the challenge of Gandhi's thought and Gandhi's figure in our contemporary world, his presence in our, however salutary and however sometimes invisible in our modern world, was how to think of humans without and beyond humanism. And indeed, this is a very intriguing proposition for me, and especially I believe I'm convinced for all of us, because all of us identify ourselves as humanists in some senses. All of us are studying humanities. And so what does it mean to study humanities without necessarily centering, without necessarily locating it within a constellation of anthropocentric concerns? How to study humanities without necessarily studying human beings? And so as a way of thinking about future topics for conferences in India, probably a way of thinking about multi-species history or histories of ecology and environmental history and its conjunction with human history, and how do we think of non-human intellectual traditions? Is it possible to think of a non-human intellectual tradition? And I'd be interested and curious to know what you think about that. And then a crucial part of Indian history, the second session was, again, a very interesting session, which highlighted the crucial role of religion and education in modern, and especially modern education, in the formation of collective national consciousness. And Professor Nilesh Bose's paper, very stellar paper, again, I learned a lot from that paper. He used the examples of Avinath Gupta and Keshav Sen to highlight the contribution of Buddhism and Islam in religious reforms of the 19th century. Amit Suman's presentation of colonial knowledge showed the connections between formal educational institutions, religious philanthropy, and colonial aspirations. What I found very interesting, and for me, I learned a lot from this conjunction of papers, combination of papers, was for both religion and for both these scholars, religion and modern education were not necessarily oppositional, and that's something that we need to sort of like learn with our history, that religion and education are not necessarily oppositional or exclusive. and that this conjunction allowed for the emergence of a fluid intellectual economy. And then we had Professor Bauer's paper actually, which emphasized the importance of the corporeal and the visual in the formation of aesthetic knowledge. And I found that the slides especially very useful, and I took copious notes from your presentation. So definitely thinking with visual and also the sculptures and the material that was used in the sculptures. How do those probably ephemeral constellation of things add to what we think of knowledge, and whether they add to what we to our canonical ways of thinking about knowledge. And I really found your paper intriguing. Dr. Prabhat Kumar's thought-provoking presentation of satire and the place of ridicule in India was, it's of course very dear to me because I also work on similar themes, but it was very interesting for me in the Indian political. I especially found your paper interesting, not just for selfish reasons, but also I thought it was an interesting argument about political and literary morality in a very situating it in a global circumstance, in the current global circumstances. That's very interesting. And in a different vein, Professor Badri Narayan recounted the ways in which colonialism mediated the Indian understanding of folklore. If all these presentations underscored the need to break down the monoliths of knowledge into formal and informal, vernacular and conventional, the next set of presentations allowed us to understand the role of colonialism in consolidating some stubborn intellectual infrastructures. Professor Tyagi walked us through some yes, here they are. I'm sorry, I think I'm missing my notes somewhere. So anyway, Professor Tyagi walked us through some of the very interesting she talked about colonial perceptions or reception of some very interesting key Vedic texts. And I was really impressed by her rich engagement with how Vedic scholarship was received and what were the transformations in the scholarship as it was mediated through the lens of colonization. And Professor Rai also had a similar understanding of, had a similar interpretation of the Ustad-Shagird relationship as it unfolded within the colonial discretionary, if you like, lens of what is knowledge and what is a skill. And I found it very engaging to think about Ustad Shagird, this corporeal, the idea of corporeal relationships as a way of thinking about labor and labor practices, and how those labor practices are disciplined into certain kinds of technologies of skill and contributing to the colonial economy. That I found very interesting. And then Professor Roy, of course, Anuradha Roy from Jadavpur University, walked us through some very illuminating concepts which we have been using rather loosely, but which have very different or rather plural provenance. And she sort of alerted us to the plurality of these concepts, and also talked about how to think with these concepts in our histories, in our writing. And so with that, I'll turn to Shrishti, and then we will have a vote of thanks from Dr. Shukla. Thank you.
Hi, so I am a journalism student, and I was very overwhelmed through the 2 days of the conference, and I will keep it as simple and as safe as possible given my background. So the morning session commenced with the theme of colonial engagement, and this theme assumed significant reiteration throughout the day. So I gathered that this is one of the favorite topics of this academic circle. Michael Dodson presented his paper on transactional colonialism, wherein through archival anecdotes he changed the meaning of transaction from capitalist channels to mediums of meaningful engagement with bureaucracy. Next in this session, Dr. Shruti Kapila examined political thought as a form of knowledge and presented her case on the absence of a self-identified conservative political party in India. Her key argument was to draw equivalency in political leaders based on temporality of their respective historical narratives of India. Following this, Professor Amar Farooqi made a nuanced reading of the problems faced by Gandhi in acquiring formal education, and his work makes a very interesting acknowledgement to the learnings of underprivileged colonial subjects in their route to acquiring education. In the ensuing session, Professor Amit De made an important intervention in one of the favorite intellectual tradition of this conference, folk culture. He established how folk music in Bengal was not just an important medium of identification, but it caused provincialization of the universal identity of a particular community. Then Dr. Shaleen Jain discussed how networks of knowledge operate in Jain tradition. One of his units of explanation was how the call to disseminate knowledge in vernacular language in the Bhakti movement was responded by the Jain tradition despite all other disassociations. Following this, Dr. Sajid Rizvi presented his observations of Perso-Arabic text with the underpinning thread of how knowledge multiplies with the interaction of ideas and an exchange on the intellectual and religious lines. The third session of the day observed another legacy of colonial past. Dr. Nandini Bhattacharya highlighted how governance guidelines of Dharma Shastras on statecraft, intellect, judiciary were received by the colonial law model. The next speaker, Professor Balaji Ranganathan, discussed the formation of law in the country with his remarks to how dharma equated to law and what was the exclusionary rate of the pre-colonial law. He then made an interesting observation of how this law transcended into Islamic law, before then into colonial law. Following this, Dr. Saifuddin Ahmed made an exhaustive reference to the life of Khane Arzu to explain the innovative style of language and philology. I do not know the meaning of the word, by the way. So post this, we had Namita ma'am and Dheeraj sir, and I have just made notes right now, so please excuse me. Namita ma'am made a critical examination of the folk literature of Mithila with her observation that writers may have masqueraded their worldview in the writing of folk traditions and henceforth authoring a model code of conduct. The Dheeraj sir, following this, analyzed the connection between the levels of living standards of working people and the labor institutions and practices in the period 1600 to 1870s. He exemplified how labor ideologies in history have played an important role in deviation in the economic curve of the civilization. All your papers were absolutely amazing. I am no one to comment, and this was the summary of the conference.
आदरणीय विद्वान मित्रों, पिछले 2 दिन से आप सभी की लगातार उपस्थिति इस क्षेत्र की ज्ञान और परंपरा के प्रति, जिसका सदैव से भारत नेतृत्व कर रहा था और कर रहा है, मुझे लगता है आप सबकी रुचि दर्शाती है और आपका प्रयास भी इस ओर है कि यह ज्ञान परंपरा और भौतिक परंपरा आगे बढ़े। इसके अतिरिक्त पिछले 2 दिन में हमने अलग अलग विचारों की तमाम आवाजें सुनी। नेहरू मेमोरियल इसीलिए स्थापित किया गया है कि आप सभी आएं और यहां सभी की आवाज समाज में और आपके बीच में जाए। इन दोनों का भी बहुत शुक्रिया, बहुत अच्छे ढंग से इन लोगों ने 2 दिन में जितने भी बातचीत हुई थी उनको ठीक ढंग से रखा। आप सभी का बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। और अमित भाई को विशेष बधाई, जिनके कारण और जिनके नेतृत्व में ये सब एकत्रित किया गया। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।